100 meters, just 100 meters stood between them and the summit when the slope beneath their feet came alive. The 24th of September, 2014, Shishapangma, 26,335 feet, the lowest and, as they say, the safest of the 14 great mountains on the planet. So why did it take two of the strongest athletes in the world on a stretch that beginners cross without fear? How did it happen that out of the three swept away by the snow, only one survived? And what was said over the radio in those hours? The thing people would argue about years later. To tell this, we have to start with the mountain itself. Among the 14 8,000ers on the planet, Shishapangma stands apart, but not for its menace. Quite the opposite, really. At 26,335 feet, it's the lowest of all the great peaks on Earth, and the only one that lies entirely within Tibet, under full Chinese control. The other giants straddle borders, reaching into Nepal and Pakistan, but this one is Tibetan from base to crown. Its very name is translated from Tibetan as the crest above the grassy plains, and there's something almost pastoral in it. It was the last of all 14 to be climbed, only in 1964. The reason is simple. Tibet stayed closed to foreigners for a long time, and it was impossible to even approach the mountain. The first to reach the top were Chinese climbers led by Xu Jing, not a light two-man rope team, but a huge expedition of nearly 200 people, with doctors, scientists, and journalists in tow. The world's first 8,000er had already been taken back in 1950. Shishapangma waited its turn for a full 14 years. It earned a reputation as the easiest and safest of the 8,000ers. Low by the standards of its peers, with gentle snow slopes beneath the summit, it's considered technically simple. And that's exactly where the deception hides. Those gentle fields are easy to walk, and they're also perfect for storing up an avalanche. Snow settles on the moderate slope, holds for a while, and then breaks loose as a single slab, right where a person has already relaxed and stopped expecting trouble. The mountain has taken more than 30 lives, and almost always the cause was one and the same. Not a wall, not the altitude, not the cold. An avalanche. This is the story of how two outstanding athletes believed in the kindness of Shishapangma. The first of them was named Sebastian Haag. He was born on the 23rd of May, 1978, in Munich, and he lived in what felt like two worlds that almost never overlapped. Down on the ground, he was a veterinarian. He treated animals, wore a white coat, did work that calls for patience and steady hands. Every day he cared for someone who can't say for themselves where it hurts. And then he would head into the mountains and become a completely different man. Up there, Haag was an extreme ski mountaineer. The idea is simple. Climb to the summit as fast as possible and ski back down. Not crawl upward for weeks under a heavy load, but take the mountain like a sporting distance. At the limit, traveling light. Time means more here than it does for ordinary climbers. Every minute counts. His constant partner became a German, Benedikt Bohm, for whom speed mountaineering was almost a religion. Together, the two of them began to collect records. In 2005, they set a speed record on the 7,000er Muztagh Ata in China. A year later, in 2006, they did it on a true 8,000er, Gasherbrum 2 in the Karakoram. Both competed for the sports brand Dynafit, and that brand was betting on lightness and speed, on gear that weighs grams where others haul kilograms. For people like this, an 8,000er stopped being a wall to be taken by siege, camp after camp, with oxygen and a string of Sherpas. The mountain turned into a track to be run. Sport of the highest class, thrilling and beautiful. But this sport was quietly changing the rules of the game. On a track, there's no time to stand for long and listen to the snow underfoot. By 2014, Bohm and Haag had hatched an idea that took the breath away even from seasoned high-altitude climbers. They called it Double 8, the Double 8. The plan was this: cross not one, but two 8,000ers at once and do it within 7 days. 7 days for two of the 14 highest mountains on the planet. It sounded like a challenge to common sense. For their first target, they chose Shishapangma. The second was its neighbor Cho Oyu, a mountain 26,906 feet high. About 60 kilometers lay between the summits, and the team intended to cover those kilometers not by car and not by helicopter, but on mountain bikes. The whole enterprise rested on human power alone, up on foot, down on skis, between the mountains on wheels. without supplemental oxygen and without outside help. Behind this expedition stood an entire philosophy: light gear, minimal load, a bet on speed. Everything Haag and Bohm had believed in for years now came together in one big project. They were joined by an Italian, Andrea Zambaldi, a strong ski mountaineer from his national school. These were people for whom altitude was a native element. Double 8 was a showcase for a new, daring kind of mountaineering. It promised to prove that the great mountains could be crossed differently, fast and athletically, without the bulky arsenal of classic expeditions. A beautiful idea, mixed with a great deal of self-belief. But hidden inside it was a weakness you can't see as long as everything goes smoothly. Speed sets its own terms, a window opens, so go, and go fast, without lingering. And a mountain lives by its own schedule, and it doesn't ask how many days you've set aside for your project. Shishapangma, the very one reputed to be the kindest, was to be the first to test that philosophy. On that same mountain, in those same autumn days, there was one more man whose name was known across the entire mountaineering world. Ulrich Steck, a Swiss climber nicknamed the Swiss Machine for his incredible work ethic. Haag and Bohm were stars of ski mountaineering. Steck was a legend. He could do what seemed physically impossible to everyone else. He earned his fame on the north faces of the Alps. Routes that strong rope teams spent days on, Steck climbed solo in a matter of hours. He seemed to be rewriting from scratch the very notion of how fast a human being can move over sheer ice and rock. Behind his speed stood iron discipline and thousands of hours on the walls. When a man like that sets out for the summit beside you, you understand. The strongest of the strong have gathered on this slope. For the final push to the summit of Shishapangma, Steck set out together with the Double 8 team. The company that came together was almost impossible. Record holders of ski mountaineering, a living legend of solo ascents, a seasoned Italian, all on one route, all at peak form. The best people, the best gear, and underfoot, a mountain considered the most forgiving of all the 8,000ers. And right there is where the trap was hiding. When everything lines up so perfectly, skill, experience, the mountain's gentle reputation, the sense of danger dulls on its own. It seems that with such a set of trump cards, disaster simply has no right to happen. Each of them had survived, alone, dozens of far more fearsome walls. Against that backdrop, Shishapangma looked almost like a stroll, the last easy obstacle before the big goal. It never even crossed anyone's mind that here, on a simple snowfield, luck would turn its back all at once on several of the planet's finest high-altitude climbers. They were preparing for a record. The mountain was preparing something else for them. On the evening of the 23rd of September, the decisive push began. Benedikt Bohm and Ulrich Steck set out from base camp at 18,370 feet. A speed ascent almost always starts in the dark, and there's a sober calculation behind that. You have to climb at night, over snow gripped by frost, so you can make the summit and get back down in daylight, before the sun softens the slope and warms the air. The two of them moved upward at a pace ordinary climbers could only dream of. By 8 in the evening, they had caught up with Sebastian Haag at the first camp, at 20,670 feet, exactly as planned. The group was assembling on the move, in pieces. A little higher, from the second camp, Andrea Zambaldi was climbing toward the summit at that same time. Around 1 in the morning, the rope teams finally joined up below the high camp. From there they moved together, climbing through the Tibetan night toward the roof of the mountain. By 2 o'clock, they reached the third camp, at roughly 23,900 feet, the last platform before the very top. From here began the final stretch. Those very gentle snowfields beneath the crown, the ones that earned the mountain its reputation as an easy climb. They moved fast and light, without bulky gear, without oxygen cylinders on their backs. In their headlamps, a narrow cone of light, and all around them, black emptiness and the cold of altitude. Underfoot lay a slope that hundreds of people before them had crossed without incident, a slope with a reputation for being simple and predictable. In moments like these, the mind calms itself. The route is known, the grade is gentle, the goal is close. Every step brought them nearer to the summit and to the record the whole thing was undertaken for. There was hardly anything left to the top, just enough to believe that the hardest part was behind them. Dawn found the group almost at their goal. By 10 minutes to 7 in the morning, they were 100 vertical meters below the summit, at around 25,900 feet. beyond that, the very top of Shishapangma, the reason people come here at all. Reaching it seemed a matter of a few dozen minutes. After the long night, after the cold and the exhaustion, all that lay ahead was one last short rise, and past it, the crown, the record, the trip home. The snowfield before them looked calm, a gentle grade, an even surface, nothing alarming. Slopes like these had given Shishapangma its reputation as a kind mountain. You walk across the white field without tension and without fear. An experienced eye saw no threat here, and that was the whole tragedy. The eye couldn't have seen it. At 6:55 in the morning, Nepal time, the slope let go. Somewhere beneath the climber's feet, an invisible bond between layers of snow snapped, and an enormous slab tore away from the mountain. What had been solid footing a second earlier turned into a moving mass. The avalanche went down, right where the people had already stood on the summit in their minds and were thinking about the descent. The mountain showed its second face at the most inopportune instant, on what had seemed the safest stretch of the route. The flow of snow caught three of them at once: Sebastian Haag, Andrea Zimbaldi, and a third German, Martin Meyer, who was walking beside them. They were swept up and carried down in a matter of seconds, without any warning, with no chance to leap aside or grab hold. Benedict Bohm and Uli Steck, by pure chance, happened to be off the line of the slide, either a little elsewhere on the slope or a step higher or lower. That one step decided who of the five would stay alive up top, and whom the mountain would take down. It all happened in an instant. The world's best high-altitude climbers were powerless before a ton of breakaway snow. The flow carried the three down across steep glaciers, breaking any resistance. The avalanche didn't stop after a dozen meters, the way it sometimes does on short slides. It dragged the climbers about 600 meters down vertically. To feel that figure, picture a skyscraper, and another one almost as tall standing on its roof. That's how far the men flew and tumbled downward in a mass of snow, ice, and debris, unable to do a single thing. And it threw them out in a completely different part of the mountain, off to the side of the climbing route, into a zone cut off by steep drops and crevasses, into a place you can't reach from above by the normal way. The snow that a second ago had held them near the summit carried them off to a spot where there was no road. When the avalanche finally stopped and the roar died away, only two men were left higher on the slope. Bohm and Steck, unhurt, shaken, they looked down at the white scar the falling mass had carved across the mountain. Down there, beneath the snow and ice, two of their comrades had vanished. Sebastian Haag and Andrea Zimbaldi were gone without a trace. Their bodies were never found. Not that day, not later. The mountain took them and kept them, as it had already kept dozens of others. But the third man, the one swept away along with them, stayed alive, against all logic, against the very nature of such a fall. That man turned out to be Martin Meyer, and his survival is a story of its own. But in the first minutes after the catastrophe, no one knew that yet. From above, only one thing could be seen: a silent wall of snow down below, with no way to reach it. The first thing the survivors did was grab the radio. Bohm and Steck immediately called base camp, reported what had happened, raised the alarm, and asked for help. Then they began descending toward the third camp, to try, from there, to break through to the zone where the snow had gone. Two experienced mountaineers were doing everything within human power, and yet, it wasn't enough. For more than 4 hours, they searched for a path to the debris. They came at it from one side, and ran into a cliff. They tried from another, and hit crevasses and steep ice drops. The avalanche had thrown their comrades into a sealed-off pocket of the mountain, walled in on every side. Between the rescuers and the mass of snow that might be covering people lay a chasm. There was no stepping across it, and the slope itself, after the slide, had become deadly unreliable. Fresh snow on a disturbed mountain could break loose again at any second. Every step in that direction was a gamble with a second avalanche, and that one would have buried the rescuers themselves. They understood this better than anyone. In the end, the search had to be called off. It wasn't for lack of will. It was simply physically impossible to reach the debris zone from any side by any means. This is one of the cruelest positions a person can find themselves in the mountains, to know where the trouble is and to be unable to get to it. Bohm and Steck came down alive. Haag and Zimbaldi stayed up there forever. And about the fate of the third man, Martin Meyer, in that moment they knew absolutely nothing. Where he was, whether he was alive, under the snow, or off to the side, unknown. The mountain was silent, and that silence was more terrifying than any roar. The rescue operation ended before it had really begun, and far below, in that very cut-off part of the mountain, lay a living man. The avalanche had dragged Martin Meyer those same 600 meters as his comrades, but by some miracle, he had survived. Injured, drained by the long fall, he found himself alone on the slope of an 8,000er, without a tent, without partners, without any contact with those who'd stayed up top. 2 men beside him had died. He had not. His situation was almost hopeless. Ahead lay a night out in the open at an altitude where even a healthy person struggles through every hour. The cold here doesn't strike all at once. It wears your strength down slowly and surely. Hour by hour it takes away your warmth and your will. To spend such a night alone, after a fall with injuries, is a trial that usually leaves no chance. And yet he lived to see morning, Exactly how, in what details he fought against the cold and the dark, that remained a mystery. The first reports honestly admitted the details of his survival were unclear. He didn't tell everything, and maybe he couldn't even have put into words what happens to a person alone with the mountain on a night like that. One thing was certain. He didn't give up. At dawn on the 25th of September, the day after the catastrophe, Meyer set off upward, on his own, by his own strength. He found a way out of the trap the avalanche had flung him into and climbed up to the 3rd camp. He reached the tents conscious. There, a group of Sherpas, who had climbed up to help, was already waiting for him. One man walked out alive from the snow that had taken 2 others and got himself to the people who were waiting for him. Against all the horror of that day, this was the single, fragile, almost unbelievable piece of good news. And it was precisely because of it that a bitter conflict would later flare up. The Double 8 project ended that same morning. No second mountain, no bike leg, no record. The daring plan to cross 2 8,000ers in a week broke off on the very first one, right near the summit. What had been conceived as a triumph of a new style turned into its loudest tragedy. The deaths of 2 famous Dynafit athletes struck the entire mountaineering world. Haag and Zambaldi were known. Their project was followed. They were admired. And when news of the catastrophe came, admiration gave way to debate, heavy and uncomfortable, but long overdue. People began to question the very trend of speed-driven, lightweight ascents of the planet's highest mountains. The heart of the complaint was harsh. The speed style demands that you move fast and that you move when the weather window opens, without losing an hour. Light gear saves strength and time, but it's powerless when a whole slab of snow breaks loose underfoot. To make it in time, the athlete steps onto the slope in that single corridor the weather has granted and races through the dangerous stretches at speed, with almost no margin for error. The critics said it plainly. Such an approach puts a person on an avalanche slope, where everything is decided by luck, not by skill. And Shishapangma confirmed this in the most terrible way. It showed once again that the reputation of an easy mountain is nearly the most dangerous thing about it. On a slope that hundreds of people had considered harmless, 2 of the most experienced high-altitude climbers died, and only the 3rd was somehow spared by the snow. Not on a fearsome wall, not in a blizzard, not from a lack of oxygen. On a gentle snowfield, 100 meters from the goal. For the whole community, it became a hard lesson about the price of speed. The lesson was paid for in lives, and there was nothing to say against it. But the most painful part of this story concerned not the style of the climb, but a few words spoken over the radio in those terrible hours. More than a year and a half passed before the survivor decided to speak out in full. Only in the summer of 2016 did Martin Meyer publicly lay out his version of events. And it turned out to be an accusation. He claimed that Bohm and Steck had behaved dishonestly and had given up far too early on saving those left under the snow. By his account, it all came down to one phrasing spoken over the radio in those hours. Meyer insisted that on the air, it was said the rescue was hopeless and impossible in principle. And right there, in his view, lay the substitution. It would have been more correct to put it differently, to say that they personally, the 2 survivors, could not reach the debris because of the avalanche danger. These are different things. It's one thing to admit that you yourself are powerless here and now. It's another to declare that no one can be helped at all. That categorical phrase, Meyer believed, sounded like a verdict and nearly derailed the further search. At the same time, he stressed something important. He wasn't demanding at all that his partners climb into the fresh debris themselves and risk their lives. He understood how deadly dangerous that was. He reproached them not for failing to rush in and rescue, but for the words they used to close the subject on the air. Here we should be honest to the end. This is the position of one side, the survivor, the one who went through that terrible night alone. Benedict Bohm did not lay out his own detailed version in the available material, and we don't have the full picture of the dispute. The accounts are contradictory, and it's impossible to put everyone in their proper place. One thing is clear: the tragedy did not end with the descent from the mountain. To it was added a bitter question about the price of words spoken in a critical moment, a question that perhaps has no single answer, and one of the two men those reproaches were aimed at was, by then, already walking toward his own fate. Ueli Stek left Shishapangma alive, but the mountain seemed not to let him go entirely. It would show through in everything that happened to him afterward. The Swiss climber who survived the avalanche of 2014 would return to this story more than once. 2 years later, in 2016, Stek would find, high on a glacier of Shishapangma, the bodies of two Americans, Alex Lowe and David Bridges. They had died on this same mountain back in 1999, and the ice had held them for a long 16 years before giving them up. It was Stek who came upon them after all that time. But that's a whole different story, and we'll come back to it later in this collection. And in the spring of 2017, the Swiss machine was preparing for a new big project in the Everest region. To acclimatize, Stek was climbing the neighboring peak of Lhotse. The goal was a match for his whole life: to traverse Everest and Lhotse without supplemental oxygen, a linking of two giants, similar in spirit to that very double-eight Haag and Bohm had once dreamed up. On the 30th of April, 2017, Ueli Stek fell. He dropped almost a kilometer down, a man who had walked the edge for years and almost never made a mistake. The strongest high-altitude climber of his generation, a model of precision and control, died the way the most ordinary people die in the mountains, from a single slip in a single second. The mountain grants no discounts for reputation. Shishapangma of 2014 turned out to be only the first chapter of a long and grim chain. It took Haag and Zambaldi, passed like a shadow through Stek's fate, and tied together tragedies separated by years. This mountain knows how to wait. Sebastian Haag and Andrea Zambaldi remained in the end on the slope of the mountain they had thought of as easy. Their bodies did not come home, did not lie in their native soil. They became forever a part of Shishapangma, somewhere out there, beneath the snow and ice, in the cut-off part of the route. Haag was 36, Zambaldi 32. In the very prime of their strength, among the best in their rare craft, they could do in the mountains what only a handful of people can. And what undid them was not a sheer wall that takes years of preparation to attempt, not an extreme altitude where there isn't enough air, not a savage blizzard, and not a bottomless crevasse. They were stopped by a gentle snowfield 100 meters from the summit, the most harmless-looking stretch of the most harmless-looking mountain. The chief danger of Shishapangma once again collected its toll. What undid them was not the difficulty of the route and not their technique. It was the very ground beneath their feet. Double Eight had wanted to prove a beautiful idea to the world, that the great 8,000ers could be taken like a sporting distance, fast and light. Instead, the opposite came true, that neither skill nor speed nor gear cancels out the laws of the mountain, that the reputation of a simple peak is an illusion, and one you pay for at the highest price. On the mountain called the safest of the 14 great ones, 2 of the strongest died, and a third got out alive only by a miracle. This is only the first story on Shishapangma's long roll of the dead. Others will follow. Legends, soloists, whole groups, other names and other fates that this mountain gathered over the decades. And in almost every one, the same theme will sound: the mountain's deceptive kindness kills more surely than its open fury. Haag and Zambaldi were the first in our tale, but far from the last whom Shishapangma took in and never let go. They called him the best climber on the planet, almost untouchable. His nicknames were the Mutant and Lightfoot. He climbed the walls that everyone else backed away from. And on the 5th of October, 1999, Alex Lowe died in less than a minute, on a gentle slope, where he wasn't even making a push for the summit, but simply strolling in the sun. What can kill the strongest of men in a place where there seems to be no danger at all? And why, of 3 friends in that single instant, did one stay alive while the other 2 did not? The answer begins high up above, with a chunk of snow the size of a door. By the end of the 90s, there was a name in climbing that people spoke a little more quietly than usual: Alex Lowe. By 1999, he was seen as the first among all, and even his rivals admitted it, people whose standing would normally have them arguing the point. And they didn't argue. When the conversation turned to who was the strongest right now, it ended with him. He had 2 nicknames: the Mutant, as if he were made of a different material than everyone else, and Lightfoot, because at altitudes where an ordinary person gasps after every step, Alex moved as though the air up there were as thick as it is at sea level. Those who roped up with him tell of it with a hint of doubt in their own words. His roots were scattered across the whole planet. First ascents in Antarctica, on the harsh Baffin Island in the Canadian Arctic, in the Himalayas. First ski descents in Wyoming and Montana, down slopes no one before him had dared to ride. He didn't repeat what others had done, and he didn't look for the easy way. He went first. The secret wasn't in tricks or in special gear. Alex trained in a way that his contemporaries could hardly believe the stories of. Hundreds of pull-ups in a single set. Endless runs through the mountains around Bozeman, Montana, where he lived. But physical strength alone wasn't enough. It came paired with a character that simply wouldn't let him back down. Where others were already turning around, Alex kept going. And here is the bitter irony. A man considered almost untouchable would be cut down by a single random moment, in a flat, harmless spot. This story isn't about his triumphs, but about how the mountain with the reputation of being the most forgiving of all took the strongest of them all. There was a second man in that expedition, one remembered less often today, even though he died in the very same instant as the legend. David Bridges, 29 years old, from Aspen, Colorado. Alex lived by the vertical, by rock and mountains. David, though, was truly a man of the sky, a 2-time United States champion in paragliding. His home was the rising air currents, the wing overhead, the long glides above the ridgelines. He came to the mountains with the particular ease of a man used to looking at the world from above. He was brought onto the team not as a climber of the first rank. For that there was Lowe right beside them. David was invited as a high-altitude cameraman. His task sounded almost impossible: to climb with everyone else to an enormous altitude, to keep both himself and a heavy camera up there, and to film what no one had ever filmed before, to capture on film the historic moment, the descent for which the whole expedition had come together. As a climber, at that point, he was only just beginning. People spoke of him as a promising talent, with what seemed like a whole career ahead of him. He was learning right there on the job, from those who were beside him. So, on one mountain, 2 very different men came together. A living legend for whom altitude had long since become home, and a talent who still had a name to make for himself. Lowe had come to repeat what no one else was capable of. Bridges to film it so that millions could see the descent. They were bound by a shared goal and a single slope. And the slope didn't care which of them was the legend and which the newcomer. The idea for which these men gathered in the autumn of 1999 sounded audacious. They wanted to make the first ski descent by an American from an 8,000-meter peak, to climb one of the highest summits on Earth, and to ride down from it on skis across the snowfields, at an altitude where the thin air turns every movement into a struggle. No American had ever skied down from a summit higher than 8,000 meters. A clean, untouched page, exactly what Lowe had pursued all his life. To be first where no one had set foot before. The project was financed by the North Face, one of the largest gear manufacturers. The money came in exchange for a film. The sponsor needed a story shot at the very top of the world, footage of triumph that buyers all over the globe would later see. Hence the cameraman on the team. Without the footage, the record would have remained just a line in someone's diary. The expedition was led by Andrew McLean, an experienced skier and climber. A strong team had gathered around him: Hans Sari, Chris Erickson, Mark Holbrook, and, of course, Conrad Anker. For Alex, Anker was not just another participant. He was his closest friend and constant rope partner, a man with whom he had crossed countless mountains and to whom Lowe entrusted his life without any reservation at all. The team approached the mountain from the south side, and set up base camp at around 4,300 meters below the snow line. From here, they had to climb higher step by step, getting used to the altitude. The mountain greeted them with the very reputation for which many had chosen it, accessible and forgiving of mistakes. That promise it had no intention of keeping. The 5th of October began the way anyone in the mountains dreams of. Clear sky, sun flooding the slopes, not a cloud, not a breath of wind. A perfect day that promised nothing but calm work. That day the team was not going for the summit. An ordinary acclimatization outing, an unhurried scouting of the slopes, the body getting used to the altitude. People were simply walking along the lower part of the mountain, studying the future ski line, sizing up where the descent would run. No risk and no rush upward. They took no avalanche beacons with them. That detail would surface more than once later on. The small devices used to find a person under the snow had stayed at camp. The route was considered safe, a quiet spot, where an avalanche simply had nowhere to come from. Why haul extra weight to a place where, by every estimate, nothing would happen? The group split into two parts. McLean's party moved up the moraine valley toward the place from which they later planned to begin the ski descent. They went their own route, surveying the slope. Lowe, Bridges, and Anchor bore to the right. They were interested in a neighboring section of the mountain, a different peak, and they headed there to assess it as well. The three walked calmly across a gentle glacier. The grade was so soft, the surface so even, that the very thought of danger seemed unthinkable. Not a steep wall where you expect a trick at every second, but almost a stroll. McLean, meanwhile, was watching his companions from a moraine ridge, some 500 meters away. He saw three little figures down below, on the white field of the glacier. Nothing in this picture looked threatening. Three friends walking in the sun, talking, doing their usual work. The catastrophe was only minutes away. But the disaster was already being born high up above. About 1.5 kilometers higher, right at the ridge, a snow cornice broke off. At first, a small piece. By itself, it didn't look frightening. Breaks like that happen constantly in the mountains, and most often come to nothing. But this piece began to fall. The mass of snow rolled down the rock bands, leaping from ledge to ledge, gaining weight with each one. Snow tore loose new snow. Ice dragged ice along with it. In a few seconds, a small collapse grew into a solid white wall that swallowed the whole valley beneath it. Above the slope rose a giant cloud of snow dust, lifted by the shock wave. And ahead of the cloud, right at ground level, raced the dense tongue of the avalanche. And it was this that swept away everything in its path. A man can't compete with that kind of speed. Down below, the three noticed the oncoming wave too late. By the time it was clear the front was coming straight at them, there was no time left to think, not a second to weigh it up and choose the right direction. Only instinct remained. Conrad Anchor threw himself to the left, across the slope, trying to get clear of the main flow. Alex Lowe and David Bridges ran the other way, to the right and down. Perhaps they were counting on reaching some kind of shelter, a fold in the terrain. No one will ever say now what was in their heads in those fractions of a second. This blind dash decided everything. Not skill, not experience, not years of training, only which way a man bolted in the instant before the impact. Anchor ended up at the very edge of the avalanche's reach and stayed alive. The two who ran to the right were overtaken by the flow and carried off. From the first rustle up above to the silence down below, mere tens of seconds passed. Anchor got out of the debris on his own, alive but badly maimed. Broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, a head injury. Stunned by the terrible blow and barely keeping on his feet. He survived by a miracle right on the edge. Later, he would be examined by the expedition's cameraman, Kent Harvey. The first thing Anchor said to McLean, who ran up to him, fit into 3 words. They're gone. Alex and David are gone. He had seen where the flow went, and he understood what had happened better than anyone. He offered no hope to cling to. Even so, the team didn't want to give up. They began searching on the evening of the 5th of October and kept it up all through the next day, about 20 hours straight. They combed the giant field of debris, the dug-up, overturned snow, trying to find even some trace of the two. Without beacons, it was nearly impossible. On a colossal expanse buried under tons of snow and ice, to find a person by guesswork was like searching for a needle in a plowed field the size of a city. Those very devices would have changed everything now, but there they lay, down below. and the rescuers had nothing but their own eyes and hands. The slope after the avalanche was unrecognizable, flat, packed down, as if struck by a force not of this world. Where three friends had walked that morning, there was now a frozen white desert without a single sign of life. A full day of searching gave nothing, not a trace, not a scrap of clothing. The mountain silently hid the two in the depths of the slow-flowing glacier and would not give them back. At some point, the men had to stop and admit defeat. The expedition that had come for a loud triumph and a historic descent left the mountain in a wholly different way, without a film, without a record, with two dead companions left somewhere up above. 16.5 years passed. All that time, the mountain held the two within it, while the glacier slowly crept downward, a few centimeters per season. The ice doesn't stand still. It flows like a very thick and slow river, and sooner or later, it carries out what it once swallowed. Spring of 2016. Two climbers were at work on the south face, preparing for their own ascent, getting used to the altitude. Their acclimatization ran through that very zone where, 16.5 years earlier, the avalanche had come down, and they were thinking of nothing of the sort. On the 27th of April, their eyes caught on something out of place in the ice. From a melted edge, remains had appeared, in old clothing, with old equipment. They had been preserved by the dense, bluish glacial ice in which they had lain all these years. It was their belongings that helped identify them. Backpacks of the very brand that had financed the expedition. A blue one and a red one. Yellow plastic boots of the kind climbers wore in the late 90s. Gear from another era, which no one who remembers that story would ever mistake. One of those who found them turned out to be a man whose name has already come up in this collection, Ueli Steck. On this mountain, he seems to be a recurring figure, and he appears here again, at the moment when the ice decides to give back what is its own. His own fate is a separate matter. For now, he is simply the one who first saw the returned. On the 29th of April, a phone call came. Those who found them got in touch with Conrad Anker and described what they had seen, the clothing, the backpacks, the boots, the place itself. He needed no lengthy explanations. From a few details of the gear, he instantly recognized the two friends he had lost here in 1999 and could not find back then, in those terrible 20 hours. 16 years later, the mountain gave back what it had taken in a single minute. And the hardest part of this story happens not in the mountains, but down below, among the living. After Alex's death, the only survivor of that slope, Conrad Anker, did not walk away from the orphaned family. He stayed close, with Alex's widow and his 3 small sons. Over time, something arose between Conrad and Jenny, Lowe's wife, that neither he nor she had likely expected. Two people who had lived through the same loss and kept the memory of one man were gradually drawn to each other. In 2001, they married. Conrad adopted the 3 boys, Max, Isaac, and Sam, and became their father. The man who had roped up with Alex took on his family, and Jenny had her own, almost prophetic relationship with this mountain. Long before the discovery, she knew the glacier would one day return her husband, and she wrote about it in her memoirs, calmly, without illusions, understanding how slowly the ice creeps. When the bodies finally melted out, it did not catch her off guard. Her words in that moment sounded simple and clear. The time had come to lay Alex to rest. The eldest of the sons, Max Lowe, was by then already grown. He became a filmmaker and took on something difficult, making a documentary about his own family. The film tells of the death of the father he barely had time to remember, of how they all grew up in his enormous shadow, of the difficult relationship with Conrad, who had taken the father's place for them. On screen, old footage comes to life, a young Alex and Conrad, who do not yet know what awaits them. This is how it all ended. The easy mountain took the first of all climbers in that very flat spot where he believed himself to be perfectly safe, and the one who survived that same avalanche lived out, for his fallen friend, a part of his life. He raised his children and became family for those he had left behind. 4 people climbed a mountain that was called one of the safest in the world. Not a single one came back. On the 22nd of May, 1991, a group of 4 Germans, Braun, Meixner, Semmler, Thiele, vanished on the slopes of Shishapangma all at once in a single day. No bodies were ever found, no traces either, and not one witness to what happened up there. It's one of the largest disappearances in the history of the mountain, and yet almost nothing is known about it. What can carry away 4 experienced people in an instant and leave behind not a single clue? There is still no answer. There is a date, 4 surnames, and the silence of the snow. In the spring of 1991, 4 German climbers are moving up the snowy slopes of Shishapangma. Their surnames are Braun, Meixner, Semmler, Tyler. History has barely preserved their full names. There are no biographies, no faces in any photographs, and if there were any diaries, they never reached us. All that survives of the group is these few lines on a list, and the mountain, which took the people in and gave nothing back. On the 22nd of May, they disappear, not one by one, not spread out over time, but all at once, in a single day. 4 people who not long before had been pitching a tent, checking their gear, looking up toward the summit, suddenly cease to exist for the rest of the world. No one sees how it happens. No one hears a cry, notices a slide, manages to reach out a hand. Between they're up there, everything's going to plan, and they're gone, there isn't a single witness left. By the number of lives lost, this event is among the heaviest in the entire history of the mountain. Not a single climber who fell, not 2 caught by an avalanche on the descent, but a whole group. And around the bare fact itself, almost total emptiness. The mountain gave up nothing from which anything at all could be pieced together. A death in the mountains is usually told hour by hour. Who decided what, who went where the mistake was. Here the story falls apart right at the start, because there's almost nothing to tell. The mountain that for years had been called one of the safest among the great peaks took the whole group at once and closed over it, leaving no hints behind. So what follows is not a tale of a climb. What follows is a question without an answer. What happened to 4 people who walked into the mountain and never came out? To understand why the loss of these 4 struck the climbing world so hard, you have to wind the clock back. By 1991, the mountain had been killing people for only about 8 years, a very short time by the standards of the Great Peaks. The first recorded fatal case here happened only in 1983. High-altitude pulmonary edema took one of the members of a Swiss-German expedition. Before that, the list of those who had died on Shishapangma was, in essence, empty. Among the giants of the Himalayas and the Karakoram, it stood apart, an 8,000er almost without a fearsome reputation. Those who came to its foot saw not sheer ice walls and not labyrinths of seracs, but long, snowy slopes rising toward the summit smoothly, almost matter-of-factly. The terrain seemed forgiving, the route easy to read, and the real danger felt as if it lived somewhere out there, on other serious mountains, not here. It was precisely this gentleness that drew the teams in. Shishapangma attracted those who dreamed of their first 8,000er and wanted to claim it on a relatively easy slope, without the price that K2 or Annapurna demand. The mountain seemed to promise, "I'll let you come back," and for many years that promise looked true. People went up, came down, returned home, and told how smoothly it had all gone. Against that background, the loss of 4 at once struck all the harder because no one expected it. A mountain that had had almost no victims suddenly took a whole group, and the firmer its reputation for safety had held, the heavier this blow turned out to be. The calm peak showed that the calm had been only an appearance, and beneath that appearance all that time, something had been building that was capable of carrying off 4 people at once and leaving not a trace. So, how did these 4 even end up at the foot of a Tibetan peak? It comes down to the era. At the turn of the 80s and 90s, Tibet, closed to foreigners for decades, was slowly opening its doors. Getting permission to climb was becoming more realistic, and toward mountains that had once been out of reach came expeditions from Europe, national teams, clubs, the first semi-commercial groups. German-speaking mountaineering in those years was on the rise. From West Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, a whole generation of strong climbers was heading into the big mountains. For many, an 8,000er was a cherished personal goal, a milestone they wanted to reach at least once in a lifetime. And Shishapangma suited that like few others, a real one among the 14 great peaks, yet, as it was believed, not among the most dangerous. A mountain where you could make a dream come true without paying the usual terrifying price for it. The 4 Germans are part of this wave. They come for an accessible summit, just as dozens of teams had come before them. What exactly drove each of them? The thrill, years of preparation, the wish to prove something to themselves. The open sources have not kept. There are no interviews left, no memories from friends, no descriptions of who these people were down below, in ordinary life. Their characters, their professions, their voices, all of that lies beyond the little that has reached us. We cannot tell them as living people. Too little about them is known. All that's known is that they had enough experience to take on an 8,000er, that they made it to Tibet, climbed up to the mountain, and began working on its slopes, and that at some point they reached a point beyond which the thread that tied them to the rest of the world snapped. It never drew tight again. There is, in essence, only one firm date in this whole story. The 22nd of May, 1991, the last day the four are tied to. After that, a break. Past those 24 hours, no one sees them again, hears them, or meets them on the route. Before that day, there were people. After it, an empty space. What they were doing in their final hours, we don't know. Whether they were climbing up toward the summit they had striven for so badly. Whether they were already turning back down, considering the job done. Whether they were waiting out bad weather in a tent. Any of these pictures is possible, and not one of them can be confirmed. There is no entry in a logbook, no final radio call, no team passing by that would have remembered them alive on that day. A disaster of this scale in the mountains comes quietly. Altitude muffles the sounds, the wind carries them off to the side, the snow settles over everything that happened. A catastrophe can take place in complete silence, and down below, they go on not knowing about it for a long time. Where exactly it caught them, by the camp, on an open slope, on some stretch of the climb, there is nothing left to establish it by. The point on the map where 4 lives broke off has stayed unmarked. And the most frightening thing about that day is how instant it was. In the mountains, disaster sometimes fits not into hours, but into seconds. One moment, 4 people were moving, breathing, making decisions, and the next, they are gone, and the mountain stands exactly the same as a minute before, as if nothing had happened. From that day stretches the question to which we still have no answer. Down below, at the foot of the mountain, at first no one raises the alarm. At great altitude, a delay is an ordinary thing. The group could have been held up by the weather, waiting out the wind, losing an extra day on the descent, failing to make contact for 100 everyday reasons. So at first they simply wait. They look up at the slope, count the hours, and tell themselves that it can still end well. But time passes, and the mountain gives no answer. No voice, no signal, no figures coming down toward the camp. The hours add up into a full day. The waiting grows heavier and turns into fear. And along with the fear comes the realization of how little can really be done here. To climb high on an 8,000er to check what happened is an almost impossible task. The people down below are at their own limit. A rescue effort in this zone is smothered by the weather, by the thin air, and by the plain lack of strength in exhausted people. And when the slopes are finally examined, it turns out that there is nothing there. No bodies, no abandoned packs, no scraps of rope, no remains of a camp, no chain of footsteps in the snow. Not a single clue from which one could understand where the 4 people had gone. The mountain they walked across looks untouched, as if they had never been there at all. The most chilling thing here is not even the catastrophe itself, but the silence after it. 4 living, breathing people seem to fall through a slope that looks safe and leave the world not even a hint of what became of them. They are not found, not then, and not later. The search runs up against a white wall and stops. Since no proof was left at all, there is only one tool in hand, to reconstruct what is likely. Not to assert, but to assemble the most plausible version out of what we know about the mountain and about how life breaks off here. And that version almost always comes down to a single word: avalanche. To understand why an avalanche in particular, you have to look at how these slopes are built. Those very gentle fields, harmless to look at, the ones for which the mountain is called easy, are its main trap. Snow builds up on them layer by layer. Somewhere up high a slab forms, a dense layer over a looser, unstable base. A nudge is enough, extra weight, a swing in temperature, an unlucky step, and the slab breaks loose. It comes down like a wall, picks up speed, and sweeps away everything in its path, leaving not a single chance to those beneath it. And it's precisely a slab release that best explains what, in the case of the 4, looks almost inexplicable. An avalanche like that breaks loose in an instant. That could account for the absence of any signal, any final contact. It carries people deep under the snow, while the mountain draws the fracture closed with fresh cover, and the surface becomes smooth and clean again. If that is how it was, the group went down to depth and the slope closed over them, as though no one had ever been on it. Every detail of the scant picture fits this version. But it too remains only a version. There are other guesses as well. The whole roped party slipping on a steep stretch, a fall through the snow that hit a crevasse, a snow slab covering the tent while they slept. Any of these scenarios is theoretically possible, but not one of them can be proven. The tragedy has no eyewitnesses, no expert examination, no remains that were ever found. We can only say what is more likely, and that more likely is the ceiling that a story like this can ever reach. And then something happened with this tragedy that does not happen often. The world barely noticed it. No films, no major books, no loud reports. The later stories of Shishapangma went out across the news of the whole planet. The deaths of the strongest, the chase for records, bodies melting out of the glacier years later. But the 4 Germans who went up in May of '91 stayed in the margins of that chronicle. The mountain did not give them back even in part. It happens that ice holds the dead for decades and then releases them. And after many long years, they are found and buried. Here even that did not come to pass. No one melted out, no one was identified, not a single find brought it to a close. The 4 stayed up there, merged forever with the slope they had walked. Of their whole lives, painfully little has reached us. A date, the way the mountain most likely took them, and 4 surnames, Braun, Meixner, Zemmler, Thiele, written down incompletely, with no faces and no stories behind them. They took on a great peak, reached it, and did not return. That is all that survived after them. And perhaps the hardest thing here is not how they died, but how little of them remains. 4 people came to the most forgiving, as it was believed at the time, of the great mountains, and dissolved into it so completely, so without a trace, that even its own chronicle of deaths barely held on to their names. What if the victory of a lifetime was just one mountain away, and standing right beside you was a rival who needed that very same summit? On the 7th of October, 2023, on the slope of Shishapangma, above 7,800 meters, 4 people died. 2 American women and their 2 guides. Anna Gutu and Gina Rizzucidlo were chasing a single title, to become the first American woman to climb all 14 8,000ers. For both of them, this was the final one, the 14th peak. They were buried by 2 avalanches, 2 hours apart. The easiest of the great mountains took them all at once, and the title went to no one. That autumn, 2 American women came to Shishapangma. Anna Gutu was born in Odessa and held American citizenship. Gina Rizzucidlo was from the small town of Auburn in the state of Massachusetts. On the big mountains, their paths had rarely crossed, but this season, both of them were closing in on the same line. Each of them had 13 of the 14 8,000ers behind her. One last peak remained, Shishapangma. This was the one that would complete the list that climbers spend years and decades assembling. The prize, too, was a single one to share between them, the title of the first American woman to climb all 14 of the planet's highest peaks. Only one could be first. Whoever reached the top sooner would go down in history. The other would be left as merely repeating someone else's achievement. That turned the climb into a race. That year, Gutu moved across the mountains with almost no breaks. First Dhaulagiri in June, then Kangchenjunga in September. And on the 4th of October, she summited Cho Oyu and immediately headed to Shishapangma. Rizzucidlo wrapped up Cho Oyu a little earlier and also rushed to the finale without a pause. 2 strong, ambitious women, used to getting what they wanted, ended up at the foot of the same mountain in the very same days. At high altitude, the logic is usually different. On a dangerous slope, teams join together, break trail as one, and share the risk. That did not happen here. Gutu and Rizzucidlo did not merge into a single group, and they did not agree to climb together. They were competing. Each ran her own expedition, hired her own people, and held only one thought in mind, to be on the summit first. For now, the slope above them stayed silent, not yet knowing it would become the arena of this final contest. And the 2 women had already placed their bets. Behind each rival stood her own guide, and here, who walks beside you matters no less than the summit itself. Rizzuchidlo did not pick some random Sherpa for a guide, but Tenjin Lama Sherpa, a man whose name the entire mountaineering world knew that year. In the spring and summer of 2023, Tenjin climbed all 14 8,000ers together with the Norwegian Kristen Harila in 92 days. A world speed record, a list that takes others decades. The two of them closed in less than 3 months. The finish was K2 on the 27th of July. Tenjin became the 50th person in history to climb all of Earth's highest peaks. To that, he added a winter ascent of Manaslu and several climbs of Everest. By the standards of the season, the man walking beside Rizzuchidlo was one of the strongest high-altitude climbers on the planet. Anna Gutu's guide was no ordinary man either. Her team was led by Nirmal Purja, the very Nepali nicknamed Nims, who had once stunned the world with his own speed project. But this season, Purja had his own task. He was climbing the 8,000ers without supplemental oxygen, and so he was moving at a slower pace. At the decisive moment, he would be lower down the slope, separated from his client. So at Shishapangma, it was not simply two climbers with their hired helpers who came together. Names came together, personal brands, and great ambition. The race for the title was fueled by the fact that it had drawn in people who themselves had something to prove and something to lose. Each was used to winning, and none of them, that morning, imagined that the mountain beneath them might have a different opinion about who was in charge here. The mountain had been preparing its answer long before summit day. A couple of days before the push to the top, fresh snow blanketed the northern slopes. The wind picked it up and packed it into dense layers, slabs of snow. From the outside, such a slope looks calm and even. Inside, it is overloaded and held together by a thread. The first warning came on the 5th of October. A group of climbers was moving toward the upper camp when a large avalanche broke loose beneath their feet. The people were dragged down about 100 meters. Buried under the snow were the experienced Sherpa Sanu Sherpa and the Japanese climber Naoko Watanabe. They were lucky. Both were dug out, and both survived. But the mountain had already shown what these gentle, deceptively safe slopes were capable of. Anyone who knows how to read snow could see a clear signal. The cover was overloaded. The slabs were ready to break from the slightest extra weight. In such conditions, the wiser choice is to retreat, let the snow settle, and wait it out. The logic of survival demanded a pause, but the logic of the race demanded the opposite. The season was running out, the weather window was narrow, and the summit had still not been taken. To turn back now would mean, perhaps, handing the rival the title for which 13 mountains had been climbed, and the alarming sign was left without consequence. The teams did not retreat. Around 50 people kept gaining altitude and preparing for the decisive push. The snow slab that had nearly killed 2 people 2 days earlier stopped no one. Everyone looked only upward to where the final point of a long list awaited them, and the snow-laden slope waited silently for its hour. On the 7th of October, still in the dark, a long line of climbers set out onto the summit section. Dozens of people from different teams crept slowly upward, toward the final part of the route. This was supposed to be the day when someone's list would finally be closed. The conditions met them with hostility. At roughly 7,600 meters, the groups ran into cold, a sharp wind, and clear signs of avalanche danger. The snow underfoot was unreliable, and the slope above looked threatening. And then what the mountains call collective wisdom kicked in. Almost all the teams turned around. Most of the experienced climbers and their guides decided the price was too high, and they turned back down. The summit that day was not worth their lives. The 2 women decided otherwise. Anna Gutu and Gina Rizzuchidlo kept climbing, each with her own guide, tied together by a short rope. Where dozens of people had retreated, these 2 rope teams went on. And here the defining feature of their climb revealed itself. The safest way was to break a single shared trail. Instead, the women split apart along different lines across the avalanche-prone slopes. They climbed in parallel, but separately, as if each was afraid to yield her rival even a single meter. Later, witnesses would say it plainly. You could see this was a rivalry. Had it been otherwise, the 2 rope teams would have shared one trail and one risk. The picture was completed by what was missing on the slope entirely. The fixed ropes the teams had meant to set for safety were, in the end, never put in place along a single meter. And most important, there was no single leader on the mountain at that moment who could have stopped the push. Each rope team decided for itself, alone, on a slope that had already shown its temper once. Around 11 in the morning, above 7,800 meters, the slope broke loose. An enormous mass of snow swept down and buried the first rope team. In it were Anna Gutu and her guide Mingmar Sherpa. On such a slope, survival is all but impossible. An avalanche moves faster than a person and leaves no chance to get clear. Both died almost instantly. But that was not the end of it. About 2 hours later, on a neighboring section of the slope, a second slab broke loose. This time, the snow swept away Gina Rizutsidlo and Tenjin Lama, the very rope team that had been following behind, along its own separate path. The record holder, who had climbed all 14 peaks in 92 days, vanished beneath the snow, together with his client. 2 women who had kept apart the entire climb died on the same day, on the same mountain, a couple of hours apart. Later, experts would suggest that both slabs may have been triggered by the climbers themselves, by their weight, by their movement across the overloaded snow. It can no longer be proven, but a bitter pattern emerges. People, working their way around each other in a race, may themselves have cut loose the slope that destroyed them. Help came slowly, and not all of it came. In Tibet, helicopter rescue is forbidden. China allows only ground teams. The bodies of Anna Gutu and Mingmar Sherpa were found at the site of the slide. Gina Rizutsidlo and Tenjin Lama could not be reached at all. They were carried off to a place from which there is no return. And there is a bitter detail in this ending. Neither of the women, most likely, ever reached the true summit. The avalanches caught them on the ascent, before the final point of the list had been set. The response came quickly. The Chinese side closed the mountain for the rest of the season. 4 people had died in a single day, 2 American women and 2 Nepali guides. The right to be called the first American woman to climb all 14 peaks was left, after that autumn, belonging to no one. The race, for which 13 mountains had been climbed, led no one to the finish. Some of the dead could be returned to their families only half a year later. In May of 2024, Nirmal Purja's team climbed the slope and, over 3 days, brought down the bodies of Anna Gutu and Mingmar Sherpa, carrying them across the border to Kathmandu. But the bodies of Gina Rizutsidlo and Tenjin Lama remained on the mountain. Permission for a search operation could not be obtained, and the mountain kept them for itself, as it has more than once kept those who thought it was simple. This tragedy became the most recent and the deadliest in Shishapangma's long, mournful list, and it set off a great debate in the world of mountaineering. The veterans said it plainly: the chase after a list and the cult of speed records push people to go where the wise turned back long ago. The one who closed 13 peaks with guides and oxygen has not yet learned to read snow and to say no. The label experience turned out to be deceptive, just like the reputation of the mountain itself. And that is the main lesson. Here, on the lowest of the great 8,000ers, it was not a sheer wall or a savage frost that killed these people. They were taken by a gentle slope, calm in appearance, and by the human desire to be first at any cost. For so long, the mountain had been called easy, and once again it showed. Speed and vanity in the mountains carry one and the same price. He had done the hardest part. He had reached the summit of Shishapangma, 8,000 meters up. The dream had come true, and a little over an hour later, he was gone. Bruno Carvalho, a 31-year-old instructor from Portugal, reached the highest point at around 4:20 in the afternoon. Too late. On the way down, he fell behind his companions, and there was no road back anymore. He wasn't swept away by an avalanche. He wasn't swallowed by a chasm. So, what is it that waits for a person on a flat, seemingly safe slope, when the main part is supposedly already behind them? This story has no star. There is a man named Bruno Carvalho, a Portuguese man, who turns 31 in 2006. By profession, an instructor, he teaches others how to hold on to the rock, where to place a foot, how to trust the rope. It's an unglamorous profession. People like him don't make headlines. Their names aren't heard in the news until tragedy strikes. On the team of the famous climber João Garcia, Bruno is known as the right hand. In the mountains, that's the highest praise. It means something simple. This is a man you can rely on when it's cold, dark, and frightening. He won't let you down, won't panic, won't abandon you. Together with 2 companions, Rui Rosado and Helder Santos, he forms an inseparable trio, On the expedition, they are jokingly called the Musketeers. Bruno is no record breaker and no glory hunter. He doesn't count the peaks he's climbed like trophies. He's the workhorse of the expedition, tough and stubborn, the one who carries the load, checks the gear, walks steadily, and doesn't waste his strength on flashy bursts of effort. For him, the mountains are both a craft and a dream. A craft because he lives by them every day. A dream because there are summits he is still only working his way toward. In 2006, a goal appears that he has been moving toward all his climbing life. An 8,000er, the first real 8,000er of his life. An altitude where there is almost no air, where the body slowly gives out, where every decision can be your last. He doesn't yet know that this summit will be both his first and his last. For now, he's simply a living man with the greatest climb of his life still ahead of him. You don't leap to 8,000 meters in a single season. Carvalho gains altitude the same way he does everything else. No jumps, step by step. He's not the kind to take a mountain by force. In 2003, he goes to pulmonary, 7,100 meters, a graceful peak at the foot of Everest. His first real lesson in how the body behaves up high. The legs grow heavy, thoughts get tangled, and simple walking turns into a struggle. A year later, Amadablam, 6,856 meters. A lower mountain, but a trickier one. It demands precise handwork and steady nerves on steep ice and rock sections. Neither Pumori nor Amadablam reaches 8,000, but it was a school of altitude, harsh and honest. Here Bruno learns the most important things: how to save his strength, how to read his own condition, how not to panic when the air runs short. He finds out where his personal limit lies, and little by little pushes it further out. And 8,000 meters remains a blank spot for him, the death zone, where a person cannot live for long, where the body breaks down with every hour spent up there. You can't step into it unprepared, and he prepares, making each next step a little higher than the one before. Bruno carries more than just his own dream on his shoulders. Behind it stands an entire country that hardly knows anything about the mountains. Portugal is the ocean, fishermen, the seafarers of the past, but not the mountains. There are no great peaks here, no school of high-altitude climbers like in the Alps or the Himalayas. For a Portuguese man, an 8,000er is almost like an alien planet. That's why every such expedition turns into a national event, followed by the whole country. The team is led by João Garcia, a man whose name is known in Portugal even to those who have never held an ice axe. In '99, he climbed Everest, and that made him a legend. People follow a leader like that without a second thought. He is living proof that even from here you can reach the roof of the world. For the Musketeers, Garcia is not just a leader. He is an example of who they could become. The expedition is put together in earnest. A journalist from the SIC television channel, Aurelio Faria, travels with the team, which means the climb will be shown across the whole country, on the evening news and in live broadcasts. The sponsor is a major bank, Millennium BCP. Behind this project stand money, cameras, and public attention. And every step the team takes upward will echo back home, in Lisbon, in front of the television screens. From this moment on, Bruno's dream stops being his alone. The desire to stand on the summit merges with the desire of an entire country to see its own people at 8,000 meters. This gives strength and adds an invisible weight. When it's not just yourself behind you, but the expectations of millions, it becomes harder to turn back. Bruno, of course, isn't weighing this on any scales. He simply goes upward, carrying within him both his own dream and the hopes of those watching him from home. The day of the decisive push arrives. Everything that came before, years of preparation, flights, acclimatization, waiting out the weather in tents, compresses into a few hours of climbing toward the summit. Today, either everything works out or the team turns back. The climbers set out and move up the snowy slopes. At high altitude, a group doesn't move in a tight chain. Each person has his own rhythm of breathing, his own reserve of strength, and the team gradually stretches out along the vertical. Someone is ahead, someone falls behind by tens of meters. That's normal. Bruno keeps about 100, maybe 200 meters behind Garcia and the Sherpa. He walks steadily, without bursts, the way he has all his life. This manner was always his strong point. He doesn't drive himself too hard at the start. He saves his strength for later. From behind, no one would have said anything was wrong. The air here is thinned to its limit. Each breath holds about a third of the oxygen you'd have at sea level. The body works on starvation rations. The heart pounds. The muscles fill with lead. The mind thinks ever more slowly. Each step costs more than the one before, but the goal is already in sight ahead. Between Bruno and the highest point, there remain the last few meters, the hardest and the most longed for. It seems the main test is almost past, and yet it hasn't even begun. Bruno Carvalho reaches the summit of Shishapangma. Beneath his feet is the highest point, above which there is nothing for hundreds of kilometers around. The dream he carried through Pulmonary and Amadablam, through years of training and the waiting of an entire country, has come true. An instructor from coastal Portugal, where peaks of such height simply don't exist, stands at 8,000 meters. This is his triumph, well-earned and the only one of his life. But the triumph has a flip side, and it hides in a simple number on the clock. Bruno reaches the summit late, at around 4:20 in the afternoon. On flat ground, that's just evening. On an 8,000er, it's a very dangerous time. The sun will soon begin to go down, and along with the light, the warmth will leave the mountains too, and with it, that thin margin of safety that still remained. In mountaineering, there is a hard rule. By a certain hour, you turn back down, whether you've reached the summit or not. A late departure means a late descent. In the dusk, on the last of your strength, in a cold that grows crueler with every minute. Experienced high-altitude climbers know the descent from 8,000 is more dangerous than the climb itself. Going up, a person is pulled by the goal, the thrill, the adrenaline. Going down, he is already wrung dry, on autopilot, when the will to win has done its work and no longer helps. Here, on the summit, at this late hour, a trap quietly snaps shut. From the outside, it all looks like victory. But the mountain has taken Bruno's time and his strength, and in return has given him a long road back. In the cold and the dark, the team turns around. Garcia and Rosado go ahead, down the same slope they climbed up a few hours earlier. Bruno is behind, and here begins something that's hard to notice in the moment, but plain to see in the numbers. On the way up, 100, at most 200 meters separated him from the leaders, the usual gap. On the way down, it starts to grow, at first just a little, then more. At some point, Bruno falls behind the expedition leader by about an hour and a half, an enormous gulf in time for people who had been walking together. Now and then Garcia and Rosado stop, look back, and wait, and each time Bruno does still appear from behind the slope. He is still moving, still on his feet, but this pace now means something entirely different. On the climb, his own pace was his strength, the calculated manner of an experienced man. Now, it's simply all he is capable of. At such an altitude, the body stops recovering. It doesn't regain strength during the rests. It only spends and spends, getting nothing in return. Every stop no longer helps. It only freezes him. And the frost here is about 30 degrees below zero. A cold like that sucks out the last of your warmth, locks up the muscles, dulls the mind. On flat ground, a tired man simply walks home more slowly. Here, every minute carries a different price. Bruno keeps descending, and the distance between him and his companions slowly grows in the darkening heights. No one sounds the alarm at that moment. He's still walking after all, still moving on his own. That's how it works in the mountains. Disaster creeps up gradually, step by step, pulling one person away from the rest. And at some point, the gap becomes fatal. The most terrifying thing is how ordinary the irreversible turned out to be. Garcia later describes this section as a flat, uniform slope, with no ice plates, no rocks, no drop-offs. In his words, it was even comfortable to walk there in crampons. No technical trap at all, and yet Bruno falls. There is no explanation. The most experienced of leaders, a man who has seen Everest, can only throw up his hands and offer two guesses. Either Bruno fell asleep on his feet, or he stumbled. It sounds almost absurd to stumble on flat snow. But at 8,000 meters, that's the reality. An exhausted, oxygen-starved person can doze off standing up, can slip into sleep for a second right in the middle of a step, and that's enough to lose your balance. The mountain did not attack. There was no avalanche, no ice wall, no crevasse. It was all decided by ordinary human exhaustion, multiplied by the cold and the lack of air. Bruno's strength simply ran out at the very moment when the main part, as it seemed to him, was already behind him. and a fall on such a slope doesn't stop right away. The snow carries a man downward, and he no longer has the strength to hold on. Somewhere up above, his companions are waiting for Bruno to appear from the dusk any moment now. And in those very seconds, he is sliding down the gentle snow, where a minute earlier there had been no visible danger at all. When his companions finally find him, he turns out to be about 400 meters below the place where they had been waiting for him to appear. 400 meters. That's how far he was carried down the slope. A figure that's hard to believe, looking at a slope like that. And here begins the second tragedy. No longer Bruno's, but that of those who remained alive. They want to take their man, to bring him down, home. But physically they cannot. At 8,000 meters, in 30 degrees of frost, after their own climb and descent, the people themselves can barely stay on their feet. Garcia has a phrase that is cruel in its honesty. We can barely manage our own bodies. To bring their companion down from here would mean almost certainly not surviving yourself. This may be the hardest thing there is in high-altitude mountaineering. Not death itself, but the impossibility of a proper farewell. They make Bruno an improvised grave right there, on the slope where the altitude caught up with him. They cover him as best they can in these inhuman conditions. And they mark the spot, so that later, if there's a chance, he can be found. There's nothing more to be done at 8,000 meters. A farewell with no time, no warmth, and no proper words. Only frost, wind, and 3 worn-out men who still need to make it down in time to stay alive. When the news of his death reaches Lisbon, the state itself takes over. Portugal tries to bring its climber home. An ascent by 2 Chinese climbing teams is organized up to Bruno's body. By estimates, to reach the right elevation, they'll need about 7 days of hard work at altitude. But the mountain decides things its own way once again. The weather turns sharply, and the rescue operation bogs down. One official cautiously reports bringing the body back as quickly as they had hoped isn't working out. The bad weather is in the way. In the end, the rescuers are forced to retreat downward to about 5,000 meters. Bruno stays up there, on high. The mountain that took him does not give him back. In Portugal, it becomes a national loss. The newspapers write that the climbing community is in shock. A small country without great mountains says goodbye to a man who reached 8,000 meters and could not make it back. Garcia himself, searching for an explanation, calls what happened great bad luck. Even he, the most experienced of all, simply has no other words. But behind this bad luck stands a law known to everyone who goes into the high mountains. The summit seems like the end of the road, the goal for whose sake it all began. In reality, it is only the middle of the journey. To climb up is half the task. The second half, no less dangerous, is to come down alive. Your strength must be split in 2, and the one who gives everything on the way up risks never making it back. Bruno Carvalho reached his dream. He stood on the highest point he had been moving toward for years, and at that very instant began the road he could no longer walk to the end. He beat cancer twice. For years he kept diabetes in check, injecting himself with insulin at an altitude of 7,000 meters. He climbed 10 8,000ers without oxygen, and the diseases that kill people backed away from him, one after another. And then, on the 3rd of May, 2018, a tiny dot in the telescope near Camp 3 on Shishapangma stopped moving. Boyan Petrov, a Bulgarian zoologist and one of the strongest high-altitude climbers on the planet, set off for the summit alone, with no radio, and never came back. Rescuers would find his tent, his t-shirt, and his insulin in the snow, but not the man himself. What happened on the world's so-called easiest mountain? Boyan Petrov spends most of his life not up high, but down low, underground. He's a zoologist from the National Museum of Natural History in Sofia, and his real world is caves. He studies bats, descending into the darkness where no one counts meters of altitude, because here the count runs downward. By the look of him, he's the last person you'd expect to set records in the harshest part of the planet, in the zone above 8,000 meters, where there's almost no air at all. And yet, he becomes one of the strongest high-altitude climbers in Bulgaria. The paradox is that nature handed him the worst possible kit for the mountains. Boyan beats cancer twice, a disease that kills people without any altitude at all. He's a diabetic, dependent on insulin. His body can't regulate its own blood sugar, so he injects his medication on a schedule. On an 8,000er where everything freezes, He also has to keep an eye on the insulin, which can't be allowed to get too cold and can't be forgotten. Any doctor would have told him, forget about the big mountains. Boyan does the opposite. He climbs 10 of the 14 8,000ers, and every single time without an oxygen bottle and without the help of Sherpas. He hauls his own load, breathes whatever thin air there is, and never buys himself a head start. The road to those summits is strewn with injuries. In 2008, he breaks his leg in the Alps. In 2009, he falls into a glacier crevasse on Gasherbrum 2, and a group of Spaniards pulls him out. In 2013, another fracture, this time in a car crash, and afterward he climbs upward with metal plates already in the bone. Every time, he comes back. For Bulgaria, a country with no giants of its own, no 8,000ers, and no big names in serious mountaineering, Boyan Petrov becomes a national hero. A scientist who has already overcome a grave illness down at sea level now endures the strain of high altitude. The tally of his 8,000ers opens in 2009. Boyan climbs Gasherbrum 1 and becomes the first Bulgarian on that summit. From there begins a surge that's hard to believe once you know his medical record. His busiest year is 2014, first Kangchenjunga, the third highest mountain in the world, in May. Then, with almost no break, Broad Peak and the formidable K2, two 8,000ers in 8 days. For a man with a healthy body, that's already a rare result. For a diabetic who injects insulin at 7,000 meters, it looks like a challenge to the very logic of medicine. On Kangchenjunga, he becomes the first diabetic in history to reach the top without oxygen. After that, the list grows almost every year. In 2015, Manaslu. In 2016, he takes on 3 giants in a single season. Annapurna, infamous for its high death rate, then Makalu and Nanga Parbat. In 2017, Gasherbrum 2 and Dhaulagiri are added to them. 10 8,000ers and not a single bottle of oxygen, not a single Sherpa to carry his load or break trail ahead of him. A style like that gets noticed well beyond Bulgaria. A congratulatory video is sent to him by Reinhold Messner himself, the man who invented oxygen-free high-altitude climbing. A film is made about Boyan. He writes a book, but this statistic has its flip side. The more summits behind you, the fewer remain ahead, and the harder it becomes to stop when the goal is already close. By the spring of 2018, Boyan has 10 8,000ers behind him, and only 4 left for the full collection of 14. The next on that list is meant to be a mountain that he himself, like almost everyone in the climbing world, considers the easiest. The spring of 2018 finds Boyan Petrov at base camp beneath the northern slope of Shishapangma. He's not alone there. A motley international crowd is working on the mountain. A Hungarian, some Italians, Nepali guides, and nearby an experienced pair of Ukrainians, Alexander Nastenko and Sergei Bershov, are setting up their own camp. That closeness, though, is purely geographical. Boyan, as always, follows his own rules. His style doesn't change one bit. The same minimal kit, the same reliance on himself alone. He sets his own pace. He answers for every step himself. On any other mountain, an approach like that would look reckless. But it's precisely this summit that has earned, in the climbing world, the reputation of a beginner's 8,000er. And here, it seems almost justified. For a collector with 14 peaks left to close out, it's a logical, almost technical step. On the 29th of April, something happens that will later turn out to be the last face-to-face meeting. Nastenko is coming down from yet another acclimatization round. Boyan is moving up toward him. They exchange a few words. Boyan says he's planning his summit push for the 2nd of May and keeps climbing. At the time, it's just an ordinary conversation between 2 climbers on the trail, and no one gives it any particular weight. And then the weather turns. The wind picks up, and the forecast promises no window for a safe push. One by one, the others make the sober decision. They turn around and head down, to wait it out or end the season. The mountain empties, Boyan stays. He decides to go for the summit alone, without oxygen, without partners, and, most importantly, for everything that follows, without a radio. From this moment, he's cut off from the rest of the world. Those below can no longer speak with him or hear his voice. All they can do is watch. All contact with the lone man up high now rests on a single instrument, a telescope at base camp. No other channels are left. Someone puts an eye to the eyepiece and searches the white slope for a tiny dark figure crawling slowly toward the summit. On the 3rd of May, they find it in the eyepiece. At an altitude of about 7,300 meters near Camp 3, the observers make out, almost certainly, Boyan. It's the last time he's seen alive. Then comes the thing after which the story has no good ending. The dot stops moving. It freezes on the slope and then disappears from view completely. Because of this, the presumed date of death becomes the 3rd of May. Had Boyan been alive and able, he would have returned to his tent at 7,400 meters, where his sleeping bag and gear were waiting. He doesn't come back. On the 4th of May, Sherpas climb up to Camp 3 to check the tent. What they see leaves no hope. The tent stands half open, the sleeping bag inside packed with snow. That means no one has crawled into it for several days, no one has closed the entrance, no one has warmed up inside. The man simply never made it back. And then the mountain shuts down entirely. From the 4th to the 10th of May, brutal weather slams into the slopes, making any climb deadly. The rescuers are stuck at base camp, powerless to do anything. At night, they leave a light burning, a small gesture of hope cast into the darkness. What if someone up there is still alive and sees the glow? What if the exhausted figure does come down along his own tracks after all? But no one comes to the light. When the storm finally lets up, an entire state apparatus is set in motion to search for one man. The Chinese army, the police, and the Tibetan administration all join the operation. At stake is not only the life of a climber, but also reputation, for all of Bulgaria is following Boyan's fate. Helicopters appear over the slopes. For the first time in 2 decades, Nepal is allowed to send its machines over Chinese territory. This is the result of direct diplomatic efforts by Bulgaria, which went all the way to the level of embassies to wring out permission. The helicopters comb the mountain at various altitudes, especially the area around Camp 2. They find nothing. On the 13th of May, the team again reaches Camp 3. The tent is no longer there. It was simply blown away by the wind. But items remain on the snow. The rescuers find his t-shirt, a first aid kit, and a little food. Slightly earlier, Chinese searchers find something else near Camp 3, his insulin and his insulin pump. The medication without which a diabetic won't survive even a few days was left lying in the snow. The man who for years had carried it to the highest mountains on the planet went up this time without it. On the 14th of May, part of the group climbs the central summit of Shishapangma. From there, they can't make it across to the main summit, the traverse blocked by avalanche-prone slopes and deep snow. The mountain won't even let the rescuers reach it. On the 16th of May, the search is officially called off. No body, no new tracks, no answer. Boyan's close friend, Kirill Petkov, who had flown to Nepal himself to help with the search, cautiously suggests that perhaps he fell into a hidden crevasse somewhere between Camp 3 and the summit. But it's only a guess. There's no one left to prove it. What exactly ended Boyan Petrov's journey, no one knows. There are several theories, and each is plausible. A hidden crevasse he fell into on a slope that looked smooth. Exhaustion, which cuts down even the strongest at an altitude where the body quickly loses strength with every passing hour. The failure of a body that couldn't manage its diabetes where there's almost no air. There were no witnesses. There's no proof. There's only the white slope and the silence. Shishapangma gave back neither a body nor an explanation. It left people only with objects scattered across the snow, by which one might try to read his final hours. And among them is the bitterest detail of the whole story. That very pump, that very ampule near Camp 3. All his life they had fit into his backpack alongside the rope and the crampons. On his last climb, he didn't take them. In Bulgaria, people followed this search like a personal tragedy. Without mountains of its own, and without its own climbing tradition, the country lost a man who alone was worth an entire mountaineering school. A year later, they were still writing about him, counting the time from that day in May beneath Shishapangma when he was last seen. There's a cruel symmetry in his fate. The cancer that fells people down at sea level, the blood sugar that forgives no mistake in the thin air, the broken bones after which he would head upward again, now with titanium inside him. Everything that, by every medical measure, should have stopped him, he managed to overcome. And the mountain he himself considered the easiest never let him go. Shishapangma kept him. One more name on the long list of those who believe this summit forgives. On this mountain, people died who later had films made about them, but these two, the world barely noticed. September of 1991, Shishapangma, an 8,000er with a reputation for being easy. Two Japanese men are climbing up a gentle slope, and an avalanche buries them both in a single instant, without parting them. After they were gone, almost nothing remained. No films, no books. Their names aren't even in the Western lists of the mountain's victims. How did it happen that two climbers vanished not only beneath the snow, but from our shared memory as well? And who were they really? Hidekazu Gomi, Tetsuichi Miyashita. Two Japanese climbers, two names that mean almost nothing to most people. And that, strange as it sounds, is exactly where the story begins. September of 1991, a slope below the summit. The two of them are climbing together, the way they had, in all likelihood, climbed many times before. And then the mountain tears loose, and the snow buries them in the very same second. Not one first, and then the other, both at once, side by side, in a single spot. After an ending like that, there's usually something left behind. An expedition report, an article, someone's book, an argument about the causes. Here, almost nothing remained. Of Gomi and Miyashita, the world's mountain chronicle preserved in essence just two names and one dry line. Died in an avalanche, autumn of 1991. No one bothered to work out how or why. Against the backdrop of the mountain itself, this stands out all the more. Shishapangma has its own famous victims, those whose names are known to anyone with even a passing interest in the great peaks. They're remembered, they're still argued over. But the two Japanese men who died on that same slope stayed almost invisible beyond their homeland. And that, in fact, is what this story is about. Not a mystery and not an attempt to reconstruct, minute by minute, what happened on the slope. There's nothing here to reconstruct. There were no witnesses, and no details survived. But a question remained. Who were these two? What world did they come from? Why did they end up together on this mountain? And why is so little known about them? To get even a little closer to an answer, we'll have to talk not so much about them, as about the world that raised them. The roots of all this go back almost a century. In 1905, the first mountaineering club in all of Asia appears in Japan, the Japanese Alpine Club. With it begins a tradition that, several generations later, would bring ordinary people like Gomi and Miyashita to the foot of the 8,000ers. First there was their own country. The Japanese Alps, mountains that are harsh but not enormous, became the proving ground where a city dweller is turned into a climber. Here you learn to move over snow and rock, to freeze and endure, to trust the rope and to trust each other. And only then, having honed the skill at home, do the Japanese head out into the great mountains of the world. By the 70s and 80s, the Japanese had a style of their own. Their expeditions were large, carefully assembled teams. Behind each one usually stood an alpine club, a university club, or one attached to a big company. People joined young, spent years rising through the hierarchy, building up experience on medium peaks before they were ever trusted with an 8,000er. The climbing style was a siege, a chain of camps, miles of fixed rope, slow movement upward. Not the heroic dash of a lone climber, but the work of a collective, where everyone knows their place. This school has a serious record to its name. By the number of first ascents in the Himalayas, Japan is among the world's leaders. The Japanese opened some of the hardest routes there are, on K2, the south pillar of Dhaulagiri, the winter face of Annapurna. Names like Noboru Yamada are known at home as symbols of an era, but this school has its bitter side too. Outside Japan, almost nothing was written about it. Finding a book on Japanese mountaineering in another language is a nearly impossible task. An immense body of work, dozens of expeditions, and almost total silence to the outside world. Because of this, many Japanese high-altitude climbers remain, to the rest of the world, nameless. Gomi and Miyashita came entirely from this school. A quiet, disciplined professionalism that does its work and doesn't demand that anyone shout about it. Inside the large team, there's a smaller unit. And on the slope, it's that unit that decides everything. The rope team, two people joined by a rope. In the Japanese tradition, the rope team means more than just a technique for belaying. It's almost a pact. We go together, and together we answer for whatever happens to us. Two people roped together move to a single rhythm. They read each other by their breathing, by the way a partner places a foot, by how long he lingers on a hard stretch. Each covers the other's weak spot. Where the first man lacks strength, the second goes ahead. Where the second hesitates, the first takes the decision on himself. At great altitude, where every movement comes only through force of will, a pair like this works almost like one person split between two. In this lies the strength of the rope team, and in this too lies its price. What makes a pair reliable on a steep wall turns, on a gentle snowfield, into a shared vulnerability. When partners stay close together, walking shoulder to shoulder across a safe slope, they are buried together as well. The snow doesn't choose who to spare. It takes everything that happens to lie in its path. The principle these climbers lived by was simple and severe. At altitude, you don't abandon your partner. You don't go down and leave your companion alone. You don't save yourself while he's in trouble. This loyalty saved a great many lives in the mountains. But it also binds two fates into one. When two people refuse to part even in the face of danger, the risk becomes shared between them. One risk for the two. And here, an uncomfortable question arises. Loyalty to the rope team. Is it the thing that pulls people off a mountain, or the thing that sometimes takes them both down together? By the early 90s, Shishapangma had acquired a deceptively gentle reputation. Among the great peaks, it was considered the most accessible, the one you could climb without desperate risk, almost like a walk at altitude. And that reputation drew people in. At the turn of the 80s and 90s, expeditions poured in from all over the world, looking for their first 8,000er or their next one without great risk. On the outside, the mountain truly isn't frightening. Below the summit lie wide, gentle snowfields. You walk across them, and it seems the worst is behind you. The steep, dangerous sections are lower down, and up here, you can finally catch your breath. And that's the trap. It's precisely on slopes this simple that the most tragedies happen. Snow piles up on gentle terrain, loads up, and at some point, a whole layer breaks loose and slides down, right where a person has already let their guard down and believed they were safe. The year Gomi and Miyashita came here turned out to be an especially hard one for the mountain. The trouble had begun long before autumn. Back in the spring, in May, these slopes took a group of German climbers. The mountain had already shown that season what it was capable of. The Japanese pair come to it later, in autumn, in a different season, along a different line. They arrive at a mountain that had already taken lives that year, but that rarely gets thought about the way it should be. The reputation of an easy peak proves stronger than fresh news of a death. From the outside, Shishapangma still looks calm and almost welcoming. A white, smooth, deceptively peaceful dome, beneath which the snow is already gathering, ready to come into motion. September arrives, and the two Japanese men find themselves high on the route. As for what happened in those days in any detail, there is almost no open testimony. We can speak only of what is known for certain. The pair climb along the high part of the mountain, and the autumn snow, having gained weight on the slope, makes the risk greater than it looks from the outside. They move the way they always had, together, on the same rope, to the same rhythm. And for them, this day is no different from dozens of days before it. Neither of them knows that the familiar is about to come to an end. At some point, the slope beneath them breaks loose. A mass of snow goes down. On the very stretch that had looked passable and raised no alarm, Gomi and Miyashita don't have a single second to change anything. They are too close to one another for their paths to part. All that loyalty to the rope team we spoke of earlier, in this instant, stops being a choice. It becomes a fact. The two had been side by side, and they remain side by side. And here ends everything that can be said for certain. They had no chance to separate, to end up at different points on the slope. To save them, or even to bring their bodies down off the slope, was already impossible. The two Japanese men who climbed an easy peak remain on it forever. And from here on, the story is no longer about the ascent, but about what comes afterward. When there is almost nothing to say about the dead, and one question becomes the main one, does anyone at all remember them? There was almost no stir. Outside Japan, the deaths of two climbers did not become a loud event. No documentaries were made, no books were written, none of the long memorial pieces that get written about the stars of big sport ever appeared. All of it simply melted away. This is clearest of all in the lists. In the Western records of those Shishapangma has taken, there are climbers of various countries and eras, But Gomi and Miyashita are simply not there. As though they had never been on the mountain at all, the Japanese chronicle remembers and keeps its own. The world beyond it hardly knows them. There is little chance in this. It's the same wall of language, only now it rises after death. And dying on a distant peak only deepens that silence. There's no one to tell of the dead in a language the world understands. The two Japanese men become one more line in Shishapangma's long and mournful tally, a line that few have read. For them, oblivion became a second loss. First the mountain took their lives, then the world took their memory. And yet, something can still be given back. It's enough to say their names aloud, Hidekazu Gomi, Tetsuichi Miyashita, to return to them at least part of what was taken away. The name is the last thing left when nothing else remains. And that alone is already enough for a person to stop being a number on a list. We have to be honest to the very end. Reliably, very little is known about these two. That's the limit, and the story goes no further. Only a few things are confirmed. Two Japanese men, an avalanche, September of 1991, death together. Everything else here is not an invented biography, but the context of an era which helps us understand who they might have been and where they came from. And yet, even from such a sparse set of facts, something grows. The story of Gomi and Miyashita is about the price of an easy mountain which takes those who let their guard down, about the rope team, and about the loyalty that holds two people together to the end, both in rescue and in death. About a school that for decades forged strong, stubborn climbers in near total silence, asking for no recognition. And it's also about how easily a person falls out of our shared memory. It's enough to be in the wrong language, in the wrong chronicle, and a vast life shrinks to a dry line in someone else's list, or disappears from it entirely. Shishapangma still stands above the Tibetan plains, still passes for a safe peak, and time and again proves that reputation wrong. And from the two Japanese men who departed on it on a single September day, two names remain: Hidekazu Gomi, Tetsuichi Miyashita. There is almost nothing behind them in the way of detail, but they existed. They climbed together and they stayed together, and perhaps for them to be remembered, that is already enough. The 24th of April, 2016, at an altitude of about 6,200 meters, three men stopped to catch their breath on a flat snowfield in the lowest and safest part of Shishapangma. This isn't even a climb yet, just a warm-up before the real goal. One of them, John David Johnston, only came to the mountains at 50, and he was preparing for his third attempt on Everest. In an instant, the snow beneath all three of them simply vanishes. How can a flat field, the kind you cross during acclimatization, turn into a trap more terrible than any summit? And why does a mountain with a reputation for being the safest take lives not high up near the top, but almost at the start? Most strong climbers reach their first serious summit while they're young. Johnston reached his at 50. By that age, he already had a whole life behind him that had nothing to do with mountains. He was born in the United States, finished school in California, and then spent long years working at Hewlett-Packard. Offices, contracts, computing machines, a world far removed from snow and ice. In 1989, Johnston switches hemispheres. Together with his wife Sue, he moves to Australia, to Melbourne, and opens his own business there, selling the products of the very company he used to work for. The business grows, but inside Johnston, there also lives the passion of a collector. Old computers, the first models, the machines on which an entire era was built, he gathers them by the dozen until the collection turns into a real museum. The HP Computer Museum in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne is, in essence, his own personal archive of an era that faded away before his eyes. Johnston doesn't look anything like the stern, ascetic mountaineer. He coaches a children's basketball team, plays American football at a local club, and even finds time to appear on screen. His teammates describe him in a single phrase: a charming man with a big heart and a wide smile, who makes friends everywhere he goes. He has 3 grown sons and a reputation as a man who finds everything in life interesting. And so, at half a century, when others are thinking about taking it easy, he truly goes into the mountains for the first time. Not out of exhaustion and not out of despair, but out of curiosity. Altitude becomes his new passion, just as computers and sport once were. This late start explains a great deal. Johnston didn't grow up on rock walls and glaciers. He came to them as a grown man who understood what he was trading the warm comfort of home for. And that road, within a few years, would lead him to a crack in the ice in Tibet. Gear bought so late in life quickly attracts big ambitions. The first real altitude for Johnston is Elbrus, the highest peak in Europe, and a classic milestone for anyone testing themselves in the big mountains. He climbs it and realizes he wants to go further and higher, and the highest thing in the world is Everest. Johnston approaches Everest twice, and both times he seems to land in the wrong season. Ice avalanches, collapses, an earthquake, the years when the mountains around Nepal and Tibet claim dozens of lives. The 2014 attempt falls apart. That season turned out to be a hard one for everyone, and very few managed to climb. The summit remains a promise made to himself and never fulfilled. For a man who started so late, that's no reason to give up. Johnston prepares his third attempt. But you can't rush straight up Everest. For the body to learn to function where there's almost half as much air as down below, you need acclimatization. The body has to spend time at high marks in advance, get used to the thin air, rebuild its blood and its breathing. Without that, even the strongest climber breaks down on the approach to the summit. And so another mountain appears in his plans. As a warm-up before Everest, Johnston chooses Shishapangma, an 8,000er that has carried for decades the reputation of being the most accessible and the safest of the 14 great peaks. The logic seems flawless. Go up high, give the body a workout at 8,000 meters, come back in good shape, and in spring, head once again for the main dream. Shishapangma is meant simply as a step, a training ground on the way to Everest. No one on the team takes it seriously as a threat. This mountain was only supposed to prepare him for the real test, not become the last one of his life. To reach an 8,000er in Tibet, which is closed to independent expeditions, you need organization and a permit. The climb is handled by the Swiss company Kobler and Partner, a well-known operator of commercial expeditions. Leading the group as mountain guide is the Swiss climber Julian Benedict Biermann. Alongside Johnston on this expedition is another Swiss man, Patrick Mattioli. Almost nothing about him is known from public sources. Another person who chose the heights, whose story breaks off just as suddenly as it began. The team moves on to the mountain on the schedule that's standard for Tibetan ascents. On the 14th of April, 2016, they fly out of Lhotse and head deep into the high-altitude plateau. The road runs through dry valleys scorched by the wind, where the trees fall far behind, and the air grows thinner with every kilometer. On the 17th of April, the group sets up at the Chinese base camp at an altitude of 4,900 meters. From here begins the slow, step-by-step adjustment to the thin air. 2 days later, on the 19th of April, they climb to the advanced base camp at the mark of 5,650 meters. This is real altitude now, where sleep is hard, appetite disappears, and every movement takes effort. But everything is going according to plan. The team feels confident, all the more so, because there's a special reason for pride. They were the first to set foot on Shishapangma in the 2016 season. Before them lies a clean mountain, untouched snow, and empty camps. On the 20th of April comes the last direct radio contact with the group. After it begins the very thing it was all set up for, the push upward, to the high altitudes, that very training climb that's meant to prepare Johnston for Everest. No one down below is expecting any alarming news. Everything looks like the routine worked out over hundreds of expeditions. The mountain silently lets them go higher. That one stretch of this easy route has already turned into a trap, and no one knows it. On the morning of the 24th of April, the group sets out upward again for another acclimatization gain in altitude. This is no summit push and no decisive dash for the top. An ordinary working day, climb up, fix the ropes, load the body, and descend. The route leads across a glacier, a gentle and quiet stretch that, in any photograph, looks like the safest part of the mountain. The trouble is, that gentle whiteness is the most deceptive thing of all. The ice here isn't a solid block, but a slowly creeping river that tears itself apart from within at the breaks and bends of the terrain. Within its mass, crevasses open up, drops that fall away tens of meters down. In winter and spring, the snow covers them over from above and forms thin bridges. From the outside, a field like that looks like a smooth white sheet, but beneath your feet, there can be a void large enough to swallow a house whole. An experienced guide knows this, and that's why he leads people roped together, testing the path. But even the most careful work doesn't make a hidden crevasse visible. A snow bridge can hold 100 people and collapse under the 101st. It can support a climber on the way up and fail on the way back. No technology lets you look through the snow and say for certain what's beneath it, solid ice or empty space. At an altitude of about 6,200 meters, no one on the team is thinking about death yet. This is the warm-up, the lower third of the mountain, the threshold of the real ascent. And here, attention naturally slackens. The main dangers, as everyone is taught, wait much higher up, near the summit, among the avalanche-prone slopes. And the three of them, Johnston, Mattioli, and the guide Beerman, stop to catch their breath. They're standing on snow that seems solid. Beneath the soles of their boots is what looks like an ordinary white field. In reality, it's a thin layer over emptiness, and it can no longer hold the three of them. It all happens in an instant without a single warning sign. The bridge on which the three of them have paused gives way all at once under their full weight. A second ago, there was a floor beneath their soles, and now it's gone. The support vanishes, and all three of them drop into the opening void. A fall like that is one of the most dangerous things that can happen in the mountains. It isn't a smooth slide down a slope, where you have a chance to self-arrest with an ice axe. It's sheer ice walls and a plunge into darkness that no light reaches. Down below, there's cold blue shadow and silence, a bottom that no shout from the surface can reach. All three of them go down there at once. From the surface, only one will come back alive. The guide is saved by chance and by a tough body. Among the debris of the collapsed bridge, Beerman comes to. Consciousness returns, and he finds the strength to signal upward. The support team, still in the daylight, begins the rescue. Pulling a man out of a deep chasm at an altitude of over 6,000 meters is heavy, exhausting work. But they manage to raise Beerman. He stays alive. His two companions can't be brought up. Johnston and Mattioli remain below and don't respond. What exactly happened to them in the fall, no one knows. The only surviving witness was Beerman himself. The rescuers do what they can, but recovering both men at such an altitude is already impossible. The mountain chosen as an easy warm-up takes 2 lives in a matter of seconds. Not on the summit push, not near the top, but at the very bottom during acclimatization. Johnston's climb breaks off at the very place where, by every calculation, it was only just beginning. The bodies will stay beneath the ice. There's no way to recover them, not that day and not later, as both become part of the creeping river that swallowed them. The step meant as a run-up before Everest turned out to be the end of the route for Johnston. Beyond it, there was nothing. That spring of 2016 turned out to be an especially deadly one. The Himalayas were only just recovering from the terrible Nepalese earthquake of the previous year. Hundreds of climbers had returned to the slopes, and the mountains quickly made themselves felt again. Over a single 5-day stretch in April, the heights took 4 foreign climbers, 2 here on Shishapangma and 2 more on neighboring peaks. And in those very same days, this mountain's glacier was melting and giving back the bodies of other people who had lain in the ice for many years. The old dead it returned, the new ones it took, all in the same season. Johnston was mourned far from Tibet, in Melbourne. 3 sons and his wife Sue were waiting for him. He was remembered at the sports club where he played, and at the museum of old computers he had created. Later, the family passed the collection to another keeper, and so a part of his life carried on without him. A man who made friends everywhere he went left behind a great many people who had someone to lose. The mountain with a reputation for being the safest turned out to be deadly not because of the difficulty of the route, and not because of the thin air near the summit, but because of a hidden cavity in the ice on an easy stretch. There's no moral here about recklessness or overconfidence. There's only the fact. On an 8,000er, there is no safe part. Even a flat snowfield you cross during a warm-up can turn out to be a thin lid over an abyss, and all the weight of a life lived won't save you if it suddenly gives way beneath you. What could possibly end the life of a man who was the first in history to set foot on the 4th highest summit on the planet? Not a sheer wall, not an avalanche, not a fall into a crevasse. Fritz Luchsinger, a legend of Swiss mountaineering, would be stopped by altitude itself. Quietly, without a struggle, from the inside, In 1956, he revealed Lhotse to the world, and in the spring of 1983, at 62, he would die on Shishapangma, a mountain with a reputation as the easiest of the great peaks, and become its very first victim. How does an 8,000er that people call safe turn out to be fatal for a pioneer? To understand that, we have to go back 27 years. The 18th of May, 1956, on the slope of Lhotse. This is the fourth highest 8,000er on the planet, 8,516 meters, and no human being had yet stood on this summit. Around 9 in the morning, two Swiss climbers set out from the upper camp, Ernst Reis and Fritz Luchsinger. Before them lies an untouched route. No one knows for certain what awaits at the top, or whether it can even be reached at all. They go first. At such altitude, everything hangs by a thin thread. Luchsinger's oxygen apparatus freezes up. Without it, at 8,000 meters, the body simply gives out, like an engine without fuel. And so, the two men, in the biting cold and wind, spend almost an hour repairing the device with their bare hands. Their fingers go numb, time slips away, every sound calculation says to turn back. They stay. Then begins the very thing that makes the freezing worth it. Ahead lies a steep snow couloir, a narrow chute at an angle of 50, in places 60 degrees, crossed by a reddish band of rock. They drive in pitons for protection, brace their palms against the tight walls of the gully to keep their balance in this stone pipe. Every meter here is earned through effort, and the air grows ever thinner. At 10 minutes to 3 in the afternoon, the chute brings them out onto a sharp corniced ridge, where there is barely room for 2 feet. And there, on this blade of snow, beneath them for the first time in history, lies the summit of Lhotse. The two Swiss climbers stand on a point that no human had touched before them. This is a triumph that will go down in the textbooks of mountaineering. And one of these two men, Fritz Luchsinger, 27 years later, will go in an entirely different way, on a mountain that everyone will call easy. So, who was it that stood on the ridge that day? Fritz Luchsinger came into the world on the 8th of March, 1921, in Sankt Gallen, his family's roots reaching into the mountain canton of Glarus. In everyday life, he is neither a professional athlete nor a public hero. His work is as an instructor officer in the Swiss Army, a man of discipline and order, who teaches others to hold the line and to endure a heavy load. In the world of great mountaineering, he is not a flashy figure. No loud profiles are written about him. He does not chase titles, nor does he collect a tally of summits for the sake of a record. He is a calm, dependable high-altitude climber, of the kind that does not seek attention, but the kind you can lean on in a hard moment. That is exactly why he is taken on to the Swiss Himalayan expedition of 1956. The road to the mountain nearly puts an end to him before it even begins. On the approach, Luchsinger is struck down by a severe case of appendicitis, an acute inflammation that in a city is operated on in an hour, but far from any hospital, among the snows and the trails, can cost a man his life. The doctor has no antibiotics. He has to treat it with whatever is at hand, in a room set aside by the Lama of the Tengboche monastery. This is the narrow point of the whole story. A man lies there, fighting the pain, and it seems the expedition is over for him. But he gets back up, his body pulls through, Luchsinger returns to the ranks, and it is precisely he, the man who nearly dropped out on the approach, who was given the summit push. This is his whole character. A man who was almost written off at the very start makes the first ascent in history of this peak. Behind this modest officer stands a great machine. The Swiss expedition of 1956 is 10 climbers and 28 Sherpas under the command of Albert Egler. The team is thoroughly equipped, and its ambition is twofold. Their goal is not only the untouched Lhotse, but Everest itself, for by that year only a handful of people had climbed to the highest point on Earth. The ascent of Lhotse by Reis and Luchsinger becomes the opening shot for the team. The first summit is taken, morale is high, and the expedition pushes higher for the main prize. On the 23rd of May, Jürg Marmet and Ernst Schmid reach the ridge of Everest. This is only the second ascent of the highest mountain on the planet in all of history, after the famous first ascent 3 years earlier. And the very next day, 2 more Swiss climbers reach the summit of Everest, the third ascent in history. The result is astonishing even today. In a matter of days, a single expedition reveals a new 8,000er to the world, and twice repeats the highest point on Earth. For small, mountainous Switzerland, this is a golden year, a moment the country will take pride in for decades. The names of the participants pass into the textbooks, and the Fritz Luchsinger rope team becomes a living legend of Swiss mountaineering. And yet, among all these celebrated names, Luchsinger stands apart. Many mountaineers repeat the routes of others, walking in tracks already laid down. He did what no one before him had done. He revealed the untouched Lhotse to the world. A name like that can no longer be erased from history. You would think that a man with such a line in his biography has nothing left to prove. But the mountains hold their own tightly, and years later, Luchsinger will reach upward once again, toward the place where altitude itself quietly saps a man's strength. A quarter of a century goes by. The equipment changes, the heroes of the 50s give way to new names, and Fritz Luchsinger grows gray. But he does not give up the mountains. Most climbers of his generation long ago moved on to the mentor's chair, to memoirs, to photo albums. He keeps going up, as if altitude for him were not a matter of age, but a state of being. In 1980, he climbs Dhaulagiri, an 8,000 or 8,167 meters high. At that moment, Luchsinger is 59 years old. According to a number of sources, he becomes the oldest person at that time to have climbed an 8,000er, an age at which others have long since taken their rest. But for him, it turns into yet another summit claimed. There is no chasing of glory here. He is not trying to collect all 14 of the great mountains. He is not fighting for titles. He simply keeps doing what he does best. And meanwhile, the world around Himalayan mountaineering is changing. By the start of the 80s, Tibet, long closed to foreigners, begins to open up. Expeditions are drawn there, ones that need a simpler 8,000er, without monstrous walls and deadly ice falls. And on the map, one name appears more and more often: Shishapangma. This mountain stands apart among the 14 great peaks. It is considered the lowest and the most forgiving of the 8,000ers, a summit where you can gain altitude without those horrors that lie in wait on Everest or K2. For a veteran of the golden generation who still longs to go up, this looks like a logical choice. Not insane risk, but a calm, manageable goal. Luchsinger turns his gaze toward Tibet. He does not know that this very easy mountain will turn out to be his last, and that it will end his journey not with a fall and not with a collapse, but with something invisible to the eye. The year is 1983. Luchsinger is 62, with the legendary Lhotse and the recent Dhaulagiri behind him. It seems a man like this can handle Shishapangma. Its gentle snow slopes are nothing like the sheer walls where climbers die in a fall. There are no dangerous ice falls here, almost no steepness. And yet, this mountain is deadly, not because of its terrain, but because of the sheer lack of oxygen at altitude. So, what happens to a person up there? Let us look inside his body. At high altitude, there is catastrophically little oxygen in the air, and the lungs switch into a mode of alarm. The vessels inside them respond with a spasm. They constrict, and the pressure within them rises unevenly. In some places, the pressure becomes so strong that the thin walls of the vessels can no longer hold, and fluid accumulates in the lungs, where there should be only air. This is high-altitude pulmonary edema. As the lungs fill with fluid, they cope ever worse with their one and only job, to saturate the blood with oxygen. First comes shortness of breath, which is written off as fatigue. Then weakness sets in, a cough appears, and there is not enough breath even at rest. It becomes harder and harder for the body to take in oxygen, and the condition worsens hour by hour. And the most insidious thing is that only one thing can help here: an immediate descent, down to where there is once again enough oxygen in every breath. Any delay, any attempt to wait it out, or to reach the goal, works against the person. On Shishapangma, this quiet misfortune overtakes Luchsinger. Experience, strength, decades in the Himalayas. Here, they no longer decide anything. The edema does not care who stands before it: a tourist of yesterday, or a veteran with Lhotse and Dhaulagiri behind him. It overtakes everyone the same way, without warning and without distinction. On the 28th of April, 1983, Fritz Luchsinger dies on Shishapangma. The cause is high-altitude pulmonary edema, that very invisible illness that had been building up inside him as he climbed. He is 62 years old, with a whole era of Himalayan ascents behind him. Almost no details of his final hours remain: who was beside him, at exactly what altitude his journey was cut short. About this, the open sources are silent. Luchsinger becomes the first recorded death on Shishapangma. Before him, this mountain had taken no one. Its mournful list begins precisely with him. In this roll of the dead, which stretches across the decades, the very top line had no face for a long time. The death that opened the count on this mountain has already been mentioned in this collection, without a name, like a distant point of reference. Now that point has a name, a biography, and a legend behind it. And in this lies the whole bitter truth of his fate. The conqueror of one of the highest summits on Earth is carried off not by a fearsome wall and not by a collapse of snow. He is undone by an insidious altitude sickness on a gentle slope, where only recently everything had gone according to plan and nothing foretold disaster. No dramatic finale that would stay in anyone's memory, only a quiet passing. After Luchsinger, Shishapangma will take more than 30 more people, to avalanches, to crevasses, to exhaustion on the descent. But the first name on this long list belongs to him. So, a mountain with the deceptive reputation of being the easiest and safest opens its long, dark chronicle. And it is opened not by some chance amateur, but by a legend of the golden generation, the pioneer of Lhotse, the very man who in '56 stood on a blade of snow above 8,500 meters. What should remain of a man who never came back from the mountain, sometimes just a backpack and a pair of skis on the snow? And 11 years later, on a different slope of the same peak, an abandoned ice axe and a single glove. This is the story of two Slovaks, Stefan Sluka and Marek Hudak, who never returned from Shishapangma a whole lifetime apart. They never knew each other, they climbed different routes in different years. But for both of them, the story breaks off not on the summit push, but on the descent, right where it already seemed the danger had passed. And here is what unsettles you most of all. The summit that people consider the easiest of all the 8,000ers, neither of them in the end ever managed to survive. The 1st of May, 1996. Two Slovak climbers slowly step onto the summit of Shishapangma by the classic route from the north. Their names are Stefan Sluka and Peter Sperka, and they reach the ridge already toward evening, when the sun is sinking toward the Tibetan ranges and the shadows grow long and blue. The climb came at a steep price. At that altitude, every step is a short breath out and a long pause. The body runs on the last scraps of oxygen, and the mind thinks slowly, as if through thick glass. The summit is taken, and here begins the most dangerous part. The hour is late, both men are at the end of their strength, and ahead lies a long descent across gentle snowfields that turn into a trap in the dark. No landmarks, no shadows. No way to tell where the firm snow ends and a drop begins. Sperka decides what any instructor would advise. Go down immediately without waiting for dawn while the legs still hold. Altitude does not forgive delay. Sluka reasons differently. He decides to stay, to spend the night right here, just below the summit, to set up a bivouac at over 8,000 meters. There, where there is almost no air, where the thermometer drops far below freezing, and where the human body does not recover its strength, but only loses it. A high-altitude bivouac is always a bet against yourself. Sometimes it saves an exhausted man from a fall in the dark. More often, it takes away the last reserves that, by morning, are no longer enough to get down. What exactly drove Sluka that evening, no one can now say. Perhaps he sensed that he simply would not make it down alive. Perhaps he hoped to wait out the night and meet the morning with new strength. This is the last independent decision known for certain about him. After that, the silence begins. And who was he? This man who chose a night at 8,000 meters. Stefan Sluka is 39 years old, from Bratislava, and in ordinary life he is occupied with things far removed from the Tibetan winds. A civil engineer, co-owner of a firm that does thermal insulation for buildings. A man of calculations, drawings, and estimates, used to working everything out in advance. In the mountains, he is someone else entirely. A skier and a ski mountaineer. A member of the sports club Biotika from the small town of Slovenska Lhotse. For men like him, a mountain and a snowy slope under his skis are not work and not a record, but a way to breathe with his whole chest. The morning after that high-altitude night, he is seen again. A group of American climbers spots the exhausted Slovak somewhere on the descent, drained, slow, at the very limit. They become the last people to see Stefan Sluka alive. After that, his trail breaks off. He never reaches the safety of camp below. On the classic northern route, walked by hundreds of people over the decades, the Slovak climber simply dissolves. The search finds nothing but his belongings. On the slope lie a backpack and skis, the very skis on which he had dreamed of coming down. Sluka himself is gone. He is not found that season, nor later. What exactly happened has remained unknown. A loss of strength after the night out, a hidden fall, a plunge into a crevasse. One can only guess. The man never came back, and on the snow his gear was left behind, a silent sign that he had been here. A backpack and skis as his only epitaph. And there the story of 1996 freezes for 11 long years. The spring of 2007. A new team from the same small country approaches the same mountain. Slovak climbers look up once more at the white fields of Shishapangma, and if they remember the tragedy of Sluka at all, it is as a distant, almost forgotten line. The expedition carries the working title Himalaya 2007 and has been in preparation since the previous autumn. Its core is two men, Josef Kopold and Marek Hudak. In those years, Kopold is a star of Slovak mountaineering. He is only 27 from Bratislava, and 25 days before Shishapangma, he had managed to climb another 8,000er, Cho Oyu, 4 times Climber of the Year of his country. For bold ascents in the Karakoram, together with his partner Gabo Chmarek, he was nominated for the Golden Ice Axe, the highest honor in the world of mountains. Beside a leader like that, any expedition looks strong, and yet the team chooses a hard path. They turn down the easy classic north, that very route where Sluka once vanished, and approach the mountain from the south, by the British route up the south face. This is technically far more serious and far more dangerous. The mountain does not let them in at once. The first attempt breaks off at 7,800 meters. Wind, snow, retreat. The second brings them up to 8,000 and again forces them to turn back. By the third push, the men are already worn down by 2 failures. Their acclimatization is at the limit, their nerves stretched tight. But in the mountains, everything is decided by a weather window, and at last, it opens just a crack. The team gathers its strength for the decisive assault. None of them yet knows that this summit will cost them just as dearly as it once cost Sluka. If Kopold was the face of the expedition, then his partner Marek Hudak had come to these mountains by an entirely different road. Marek is 37 years old, born in the Slovak town of Detva, and living in Zalesia near Bratislava. He has a family and 2 children, and for them he is above all a father and a businessman, not a conqueror of 8,000ers. Hudak came into serious sport not through the mountains at all. First there was handball, serious handball, at the level of the Czechoslovak junior national team, and a club from Bratislava. A team sport, physical, thoroughly flat land, far from ice axes and oxygen masks. But at some point, he is drawn to where it is quieter and higher. Handball gives way to ski mountaineering and rock climbing, and the mountains take up more and more space in his life. Step by step, he climbs higher and higher, until true giants appear on the horizon. Before Shishapangma, Hudak already has Himalayan experience, and bitter experience at that. In 2005, he takes part in an expedition to Cho Oyu, and that trip, according to Slovak reports, ends in tragedy. The team loses a comrade and goes back down. Hudak knows firsthand that these mountains know how to take people away, and still he comes back. Shishapangma becomes his next great goal, an 8,000er that, from the outside, seems attainable even for a man who started out on a handball court. On the decisive push, Marek climbs high, almost to the summit ridge, but onto the very top he does not go. Just below the summit, Hudak turns around and begins the descent, that same sensible decision that was meant to spare his strength and return him to his children. On the 24th of April, 2007, Josef Kopold reaches the summit of Shishapangma alone. He barely feels the victory. On the ridge, he is met by a gale and dense fog. The visibility shrinks, the cold cuts straight through. Kopold does not linger on the top for a single minute, does what he came for, and turns straight back down. Somewhere lower, his partner should already be waiting for him. They had agreed to meet at the high camp and descend further together. But the meeting never happens. On the descent, Kopold stumbles on familiar things in the snow. Marek Hudak's ice axe and glove, discarded, lying where they should not be. And he understands. This is a very bad sign. An experienced man does not just throw away his ice axe on the descent. The marks in the snow read with alarm, as if someone had fallen here, and Hudak himself is nowhere. Not on the trail, not by the rocks, not down below. The camp where they had counted on taking shelter and warming up is by now buried under fresh snow. The weather is rapidly worsening. Snow pours down, visibility falls to a few dozen meters, and the whole slope turns into a blank white wall in which you cannot make out a man 3 steps away. Kopold calls, searches, comes back. But the mountain answers with silence. The search begins. It lasts 3 days. The Slovaks are joined by Korean climbers who had been working on the same mountain. People comb the slope as far as the weather allows at all. But the snowfall does not stop, and time is working against them. At that altitude, in that cold, the chances of finding the missing man alive melt away with every hour. Marek Hudak is never found. He vanishes without a trace. Shishapangma once again does not give back the missing, and the search has nothing to hold on to. 2 fates, 11 years apart, different teams, different routes. Stefan Sluka and Marek Hudak never met, and most likely did not even know each other's names. And yet their stories match almost down to the smallest detail, as if the mountain had told them twice in the very same words. Both were Slovaks from a small country without great mountains of its own. Both came to high altitude not by a straight road. One an engineer with skis, the other a former handball player. Both were drawn upward to the snow and the silence of the big mountains. Both got almost to the very goal, and both vanished, not on the hard summit push, but on the descent, at the very moment when the worst, it seemed, was already behind them, and all that remained was to get down. From each of them what was left was not a body, but a handful of belongings. From Sluka, a backpack and a pair of skis on the northern slope. From Hudak, an ice axe and a glove on the southern one. Objects that were found in the snow, while the men themselves were not. Neither one of them did Shishapangma ever give back. For decades this mountain has carried the reputation of the easiest of the 8,000ers, the one people set out for in the hope that it will turn out fine. But it is precisely on its gentle, deceptively calm slopes that the list of the missing keeps quietly growing, year after year. Sluka and Hudak are only 2 names in that long roster, 2 shadows that dissolved into the snow 11 years apart. And perhaps the most unsettling thing here is that the people vanish not with a crash and not in plain sight, but quietly. So quietly that there is not even a place left where one could come and bow.